Hi, this is Paul. I was going to first do the McGilchrist, a commentary on the McGilchrist conversation, but the response from many of you has been, do this now. So, okay. And having gone through it today, I can see why. This is a special conversation, and part I'm disappointed that Fry had to leave because it really started getting good right at the end, and we're a ways from the end. So part of me wants to jump right to the end, but you can't really jump to the end because you have to understand where they get there or how they get there. Now, they start out sort of talking about the culture war stuff, which in the Munk debate that you can watch, Stephen Fry and Jordan Peterson were teamed up. And Fry was just devastating in there, but Fry is a gay man and a comedian and in many ways, a reliable liberal who, as he says here, has been upset by the fissure that has opened up in society. Now, why should that upset him? Those who believe that what is required for our culture to break through traditional impediments and blockages and to arrive at the great world that can't be had, we're on the opposite side of Stephen Fry. Now, if you listen to the whole thing, that begins to make sense as it goes along, because in some ways, it seems, what would Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry have in common? Now, Stephen Fry has just written 2 books on mythos and heroes, and he's working on Troy, which will come out. I've listened to some of Mythos, and I enjoy it. Stephen Fry was on my favorite podcast, The Rest is History, and his appearance there was tremendous. I really enjoyed him there. He's, as Peterson notes, he's a tremendously talented individual, fun to listen to, terribly bright, astoundingly well-read, incredibly well-spoken. Is a remarkable human being. And yeah, of course, and I always say, everyone has a right to their own politics and religion. And part of the genius of the West has been everyone has a right to their own politics and religion. And we're not going to imprison you or ostracize you for your thoughts or words. Deeds are a little bit more important, so we have laws about that, but there ought not to be laws about our thoughts and words. So let's jump in, because they begin with the culture war stuff, but very quickly go away from it. And that's what makes this good. Now, understanding where Stephen Fry comes down on the culture war things takes a little bit more work, but let's jump in.
Little like the Munk debate we shared a platform with. It's really because I'm so tired and distressed and worried by the great fissure that has opened up, the culture wars, whatever we like to call it, the assumption that that there is your friends and your enemy and no ground in between, no commonality no cohesion of viewpoint, no shared things that can happen between people who apparently represent different ways of looking at the world or different ways of trying to organize the world or whatever it might be. And
why can't we all get along? Rodney King.
The very fact that I knew some friends of mine who disapproved of you would think I was doing something wrong by associating with you. And I hope our debate showed that wasn't the case. And I felt that this would take that further forward too. I do think the last best hope for our society, in whichever way you want to look at it, whether you want to look at it as some version of the West being able to stand up to the pressures put upon it by China and Russia and other countries that are less interested in liberality in economics and in the traditional political sense of liberality, or kind of open society, or whatever you want to call it, that if we continue to fracture and we continue to find enemies amongst our own kind so much, then really it's a very, very sad look at. I mean, I'm hardly the first person to say this, but and I think you are, a very interesting thinker.
So in other words, if we continue to weaken ourselves by perpetual infighting, elements such as China and Russia will gain increasing supremacy on the world, and the West will lose their hegemony, and this will be a bad thing for liberality, as he says. So in many ways, you know, he, like Peterson, sort of a classical liberal.
And writer and talker. But it's clear that there are many who would really admire you and like you and follow you, with whom I would have less in common than perhaps with you. I think on both sides, if you want to call them sides, it's very easy to be a bit lax about disavowing people who like one, but whom one doesn't like, if you see what I mean. It's so flattering to the ego to have followers, to have people say, you're great, I love the things you say, that...
In other words, can people discipline their fans? It's in some ways what he's referencing here are the monks and the mooks and knights, that this terrific article that I talked about a while ago, Mooks and Knights. Will people be captured by their audience?
It's quite hard to say no, but you've misunderstood me. That's not what I meant. That's not what I meant at all, to quote Eliot.
So, obviously, I've spent some time pointing out what I regard as the excesses of the radical left. I've certainly spent no shortage of time pointing out the excesses of the radical right in my classes, particularly, but I'm not publicly known for that specifically. It's my resistance my resistance to certain maneuvers on the side of the radical left that propelled me into the public eye. I've thought for a long while that the only people who can probably control the excesses of the radical left are people who are in the moderate left, not people on the right or on the extreme right. They're out of the argument to begin with, and this is associated in some sense. The difficulty of this is, in some sense,
probably control them in terms of the kinds of control we want, which are nonviolent and mostly verbal and persuasive.
The difficulty that you just described, if people have an affiliation with you, then it's much more difficult to differentiate perhaps where you should. And so
the mooks capture the knights.
Perhaps you see on the left, the moderate leftists, and then the more extreme leftists, but the extreme leftists are also on the left, and they're friends of a type. And drawing that line is extraordinarily difficult. And that's actually why, at least part of the reason why, I'm leery of any attempts to restrict free speech, because in those cases of difficult differentiation, the only possible solution we have is dialogue about the problem.
In other words, if we're not going to descend into violence where these ideological tribes war on each other and shed blood, we have to talk.
Exactly where to draw the line. Yeah. Because otherwise we can't. No one knows how. Yeah. And I guess it's because extremism also exists in degrees. And so you say, where do you stop? Yeah. And well, that's very, very difficult to say, especially among those who think like you, except for certain exceptions.
Yes, this is very true. And it's a sort of basic philosophical point, isn't it? That you can draw lines between what is reasonable, and they can be very narrow lines, but if you keep drawing them out, they become extreme. So, for example, you can have what some people might regard as a reasonable age for the termination of a pregnancy due to some issue.
Most European nations have their legislation about abortion. They have restrictive legislation about abortion after 14 weeks. And you can just look that up on Wikipedia. But the point he keeps making is, well, you keep chopping this up day after day after day. Pretty soon it's
but if you keep adding days to it, it then becomes a serious problem. And anything in that nature of differentiating and drawing lines is bound to cause that to be a problem. And I however, am less confident than you are that the left would be persuaded by someone like me, the hard left, the one wants to call it extreme left or the radical left, wherever it is. And this may sound a bit like a bit of boo-hooing, which is very easy to do. But if you're a soft liberal, as I think of myself, I can't find any other designation, but that sort of thing, a centrist. These are insults to the left. I mean, in English politics recently, for example, centrist was the boo word of the Corbynistas, the more socialist end of the Labour Party, a party I've been a member of since I could vote. And
now, he's got a real point here. I mean, Fry is a very sharp guy. That in many ways, it's the softies, it's the moderates that are the ones that are most distasteful because they're not serious. They're not out there. And you hear this all the time. It's the apathy of all the well-meaning people who sort of think like us but don't take to the streets or the barricades and overthrow the government. This is an oft-repeated complaint of any vanguard which wants to change the world, that it's the apathetics. And you see this in almost every culture war. This is part of, let's say, the first century Jewish culture war, where it's going to be the Lord comes back and he's going to not only take out the corruptors of the chosen nation and the cherished people, and the promised land, but he's going to mop up all of the wobbly people who didn't get their act together and weren't shrill and on the barricades and committed to the cause. And so it's a devastating point made by Fry.
I felt very, very, very much buffeted about and despised for my, oh dear, but really, and oh must we?
You're a gay man. You're supposed to be out there with us. Why you're letting down your tribe?
Very, I do think of myself as a sort of cardiganed, beslippered old fool who is loathed on both sides. And it is, of course, historically true that in the 1930s, which is the decade we always go back to when we're very worried about the direction we're traveling in now, the communists and the Nazis both were absolutely of one mind when it came to people like me, Jewish, semi-intellectual, soft liberals who went, oh no, but shush, because for the communists, for example, the revolution, according to Marx, was supposed to just sort of well up. And of course, it's the Leninists that said, no, you need to be the vanguard in order to make the revolution happen, because the regular people, they're like mice. They're apathetic. It's ironic that one should really say that affluence is the opium of the people rather than religion, because people will overturn the state for religion, but affluence and a comfortable shelter and reliable food and affordable distractions, this is what makes a population docile. It's just true. Because we didn't have any positivity, any certainty. It's... And as I say, I know it sounds like I'm sort of taking on a victim status here, that, oh, poor liberals, because after all, we've ruled the world for 200 years. And part of the political and cultural argument in the world at the moment is that the liberal project, the Enlightenment project, if you want to call it that, has failed.
Well, I would say we've cooperatively guided the world.
Now, before we get to Peterson, what Peter just said, which I think is an excellent point too. I mean, this whole conversation is good. How has liberalism failed? What has liberalism failed to bring? Well, it's failed to eliminate, well, depending on what your big baddies are, failed to eliminate the patriarchy or racism. It has failed to. But again, when you talk to utopians, it's really important to invite them to, okay, describe for me this world that you would like to bring in detail. Draw a picture for me, please. Because you're basically saying in order to have the omelet, you have to crack the egg. And of course, It was, where's the omelet? Or at least describe the omelet to me. Draw me a picture, but not just a vague picture that has a soundtrack, as John McWhorter said. Show me the picture in detail, because, I'd like to see what I have to sacrifice for before I make the sacrifice.
Because I think ruled is the wrong term. The
Enlightenment project, if you want to call it that, has failed.
I would say we've cooperatively guided the world, because I think ruled is the wrong term.
Well,
now, that's such an interesting turn that he takes there. We've cooperatively guided the world. Okay, then what's doing the pushing?
Monarchs and tyrants rule, and it's a really important distinction, because that power is grounded in the sovereignty of the people, and
it's almost cooperatively guided. It's more of a belief in progress of a certain posture than, let's say, the inevitable progress that was abandoned by the Leninists that was inherent in Marxism. It's a very interesting turn by Peterson to jump on this moment here.
Imperfect as that may be, it's more grounded in the sovereignty of the people than any other system we've ever managed to whip up.
And it's very Jeffersonian, grounded in the sovereignty of the people. Well, what is the people? The people is this construct. And a little bit later, Fry's going to quite rightly make the point about Uncle Sam, but that the people sort of together as a community, they create something that we rightly attribute agency to.
So, I mean, it's difficult also because it's difficult to make centrism dramatic and romantic. And it's much easier to make extremism dramatic and romantic. And that's one of its primary attractions. And
Peterson makes this point with the types of conversations he does where people are saying, oh, the world is getting better, and we're actually going to make progress on climate and economics and poverty and all of these things. But this, in many ways, Peterson is a gradualist's apologist.
That attraction should not be underestimated. And it's partly why I'm so interested in talking to you, because you are this incredible dramatist. You have this unbelievable talent.
Every time he says drama, I always think of Dramamine. I always think dramatist, but just accent. But every time he says it, I always think drama. Talent
that manifests itself in a manner that I thought I was reading your Wikipedia biography in some detail, and it requires that. I thought if you want to give yourself an inferiority complex quickly, going through your Wikipedia entry is a very good way of doing that. I mean, you have 50 films and like 40 TV shows and 5 novels and 7 autobiographies and a career in comedy.
7 autobiographies. The most autobiography life imaginable.
That was absolutely outstanding. That would have been a lifetime achievement in and of itself, and a whole variety of honorary doctorates. And you have an intellectual end that's not trivial as well, because you were involved with Hitchens and Dawkins and the horsemen of the of the atheist movement. Yeah, and I really want to talk to you about that too, because I especially am interested in your opinions, because of all those people, you're the one that has the most connection with drama and literature and fiction. And you just published a couple of books.
I think after listening to this, he is a far greater opponent than those 4 horsemen. Very, 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 very powerful. Mythos,
heroism, heroes, and there's a third one in that trilogy. It just escapes my mind. Troy. Yeah. And so you're obviously extraordinarily sensitive to the power and necessity of literary accounts, but then you're also a humanistic atheist, and I'm very curious about that. I mean, someone like Dawkins, he's so rational. Yeah. That I think for him, and I don't know if this is fair, and it might be a bit of a stereotype, but it'll do for rhetorical purposes. He's not gripped by drama in the same way you are. And there's a truth in drama that's not trivial, and that truth is allied with religious truth. So I want to go there too.
I can't speak for it.
It's a truth in drama that's allied to religious truth. I mean, it's just a little throwaway sentence, but it's really true, and it's a very profound comment. People are sending me books now. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but someone just sent me this, Ritual in Human Evolution and Religion.
Richard, it's just been his 80th birthday, so we wish him happy birthday. And he's not the shrill beast of atheism that some people regard him as, but I won't speak for him, obviously. But what I would say is that, yes, you're right, he's a rationalist, and I don't think I am. I think I'm an empiricist.
Now, what he says here and what he does now is key to understanding this entire conversation, and he lays it out beautifully.
And I think that's part of my love of drama and myth and story and literature and history even, is these are all to do with experience, with human experience, the register of human experience.
Now, in my previous videos last week, I talked a lot about, and this is so much of what the McGill-Christ Peterson video goes into. You have, just the words that I've been using, you have your narrative and you have your data. And so think about how he lays out his reason versus empiricism as sort of a which side is more heavily weighed, your narrative or your data. Now, obviously, for both, you need both, but which side sort of has the thumb on the scale?
Of testing an idea against what actually happens and how people actually behave, rather than devising a system of reason. And it's not that reason and empiricism are always absolutely opposed, but they sometimes are. And in the history of science, they have been.
And you have to say that reason and empiricism are always working together. They're always working together. And in many ways, it just depends which side has the supremacy in terms of the weight. And a lot of that is sort of the difference, at least with the Myers-Briggs, between the judging and the perceiving. And so empiricism would be a bias towards the perceiving, and rationality would be the bias towards your narrative and the judgments of your narrative.
You know, you could argue that Pascal was a rationalist and Newton was an empiricist for all his, great mathematics and so on. He actually took a piece of cardboard and punched a hole in it, which is something that a rationalist probably wouldn't do. So it's experimenting in the crucible of human activity and observing what people say and hear. These are the things comedians do all the time. It's the comic mode.
Which is part of the reason when comics do films, I remember some Steve Martin films where I find comics to be tremendously perceptive. They have to be. And I think that's what he's talking about here with his empiricism.
Is to hear somebody say something grand and then say, yes, but G.K. Chesterton is a perfect example of that. Now, he was certainly no atheist. He was a very religious man indeed, and a great hero of the Catholic Church. And some people even believe he should be, if not beatified, even sanctified. But he was a huge influence on me as a teenager growing up because I read his essays. And here's an example.
This makes me want to look at one of his 7 autobiographies.
He opens an essay by saying, I read in the newspaper the other day this following sentence: at the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, modern woman rises to take her place in society. And I thought to myself, this is very good news, very encouraging. I wonder if it's true. Let's see. Now, who's a modern woman? Oh, Mrs. Buttons. She comes in to clean every Tuesday and every Thursday. She lives in Clapham. She comes on the omnibus and she scrubs the floors, and she has 3 children. And if I say to myself, at the trumpet call of Ibsen and Shaw, Mrs. Buttons rises to take her place in society, I realize the sentence is not only nonsense, it's pernicious nonsense.
I'd be far more hesitant to debate this man than Sam Harris any day of the week.
And that's a sort of almost comical example, really, of saying you don't trust an abstract statement. You do not trust someone saying A plus A equals 2A, because there is no such thing in the universe as A. And although we're all capable of doing substitutional metaphorizing or algebra, as it were, with ideas, the fact is it's much better to say one thing of something that is real that we know plus another thing of something that is real that we know and have experienced is two of those things. Once you start abstracting, and that's what rationalism often is. It's going off on an algebraic journey, which can produce beautiful thoughts and ideas and beautiful schemes. But for me, it is beating that out on the anvil of human experience is the absolute key. And it's a long intellectual tradition.
That was just a terrific example and a terrific illustration of substitution, of abstraction, of theorizing. But it's important to recognize that what he just delivered to us is, in fact, the thing that he just also undercut. Because he just delivered to us a rational theory, an abstraction. In fact, it's up quite a few levels, a meta-abstraction of abstraction. And he's saying we ought to be careful about these abstractions. And so, well, we ought to be careful about this one too. But he's so clever that he made an argument for what he's calling empiricism and skeptical about abstraction, and the argument itself is an abstraction. And that this is one of the things about thinking that we can't get away from. And he's of course right. You have to test this, but there's a this you have to test, and you use this to test this itself. And it's easy to say, oh my goodness, that's so true, forgetting about the fact that he's just in some ways undermined what he's just said. And there's a lot of that in his arguments.
Empiricism. And I think we're in danger of losing it in a way, because... Okay,
I want to unpack three things that you...
You should get the sense that Peterson's sitting there, he's holding it in, and he's holding it in, can't take it anymore. And but I'm super excited about Wave 2 because Peterson's better, especially in these conversations, than he was in Wave 1. And if these conversations have a tremendous amount of potential, you know, certainly far more potential than interviewing, you know, doing interviews with the press, and certain kinds of potentials. He wouldn't be talking to Stephen Fry if he didn't have his big blow up with Cathy Newman. And this is where, again, I hear a lot of dismissive comments about mass media is going away. YouTube is the wave of the future. Oh no, but mass media continues to have its place. It is still massive as compared to this. Many people, I would imagine, believe Jordan Peterson has gone away when, you know, perhaps there's the potential here for him to do some of his best work.
That you just said that are very, very complicated. So the first thing you did was draw a distinction between rationalism and empiricism. And you associated Dawkins more with rationalism and yourself more with empiricism.
Yes, not entirely, but yeah.
No, fair enough. Just as example. And you did that in an attempt to also describe the effect or influence or consequence or reason for your interest in drama, or for the fact that drama grips you. So I want to start with the distinction between between empiricism and rationalism, so everyone listening understands. So walk us through that first.
Well, empiricism is an intellectual tradition of using experience or trial and error or experiment to prove or disprove or to investigate an idea. So if you have an idea, I mean,
pay attention that explanation of empiricism was itself a rational abstraction. So again, I'm not saying that to debunk or anything. It's just that these two always work together. They can't help but work together. And he's talking about a bias towards one rather than the other.
Perfect example is in the 18th and 19th century, a lot of women were dying of childbirth, at childbirth, appalling deaths, what we would now call septicemia. The babies and the mothers were dying, and nobody knew why, because there was no germ theory. Nobody had an idea that there were these tiny things that could infect our systems. So people tried to reason, and they said, well, maybe it's the smell because it's a bad smell around. There was a miasma theory. And other people just said it was God, or other people said that it was some moral quality on the part of the women. But a man called Semmelweis in Hungary, Ignaz Semmelweis, tried lots of different experiments. He chose a certain number of people to do different things on what we've now called cohort testing, or not quite random double-blind testing, such as used as in medicine to prove the efficacy of something. But eventually, he got a group of medical students who were attending on these births to wash their hands before doing it. It was an almost random thing to do. And suddenly the death rate dropped. I mean, absolutely plummeted.
It was almost random. It might have been called religious. Washing and religion, as a very old, just, Jesus critics. We notice your disciples don't wash before they eat.
And the reward for Semmelweis?
He was sent to a madhouse.
Now, this is a great example of empiricism. Later in this conversation, when he gets to talking about religion, he is going to complain about what he's calling now rationalism does, which is to transport us in some ways up into the heavenlies, to take something that is of the moment, of the now, in the physical, and turn it into a rule or a law or an always or something that is above. And that's the heart of his empiricism versus rationalism. His skepticism that he says we've taken too much up there and made it eternal. But now pay attention. The example is above the practical and the here and now. And what it leads to is, of course, germ theory. But germ theory then is that process of taking it up into the heavenlies and making it a rule, making it a policy that everyone who assists a woman in the process of child labor should wash their hands. We have good reasons for it, but that is now a rule. And even if the reasons are lost, it will still work. That is part of the process of this narrative data issue. And often once something becomes so complete that the narrative gets higher and higher and higher, the recollection for the data is lost. And we've had a lot of examples of this in the pandemic, because when the pandemic hit, suddenly there was an awareness of, oh, that's right. Buildings used to have all of these windows that we could open, and we have sealed ourselves in these climate-controlled places that recirculates the air, and this might be a problem.
Because nobody believed
where he died, I
because
believe.
The rationalists said there's no reason that could be right. But a true empiricist would say it almost doesn't matter what the reason is.
But you need the rationalist to say it always matters to wash your hands. The true empiricist would just keep washing their hands and say, I don't know why washing my hands works. And I am, in fact, going to resist making a rule about it and transmitting it to my children. I'm just going to leave it at the practice of hand washing, and that's where we get into ritual. But rituals are, in fact, practice plus habit with a degree of intentionality, and I would argue faith. But anyway, again, this is a tremendous conversation.
The fact is, it's repeatable and verifiable. And even not understanding, because it took later.
See, and verification. So what is rationality? Rationality is sort of this checking, this substitution, this hypothesizing, this substitution, and this checking. And again, he's not against reason, but I'm just pointing out you have to use reason in order to check and then abstract to what is assumed behind this excellent illustration he uses. Of course, we all religiously believe in germ theory. And I love that illustration because when I was a missionary in the Dominican Republic, I would watch these incredibly well-meaning young people go into these small Haitian communities, and they were usually attached to religious organizations, and they would go into these communities and lecture the people on the idea that the world was filled with tiny things that they couldn't see, and that what they needed to do was wash their hands and keep the animals out of the house and not let their children crawl around where the animals had been, and this would keep them from having parasites and all of the kinds of things that kept the infant mortality rate high in their communities. What were those young medical brigades doing but offering rationality, a religion? Anyway,
until Koch and Pasteur and microscopes could show what the process was. He actually did end up in a, and he's a hero, man. I actually went to Budapest to go to the Ignaz Semmelweis Museum in Buda, just to sort of pay homage to this remarkable man. And I mean, it's a bit unfair on the doctors. They had no reason to know, if you like, but that's the point. They had no reason to know. An example we all deal with of empiricism,
and now we do have a reason to know. And that reason is carrying us even after we forget what hand washing is for. And we tell people it doesn't matter whether you know it or not, just wash your hands.
Which can be very annoying, is in insurance. What's called actuarial tables, or actuaries, are people in insurance companies who look at the statistics. And if they discovered that when your name is Jordan, you are 10% more likely to have a car crash, you would pay 10% more of premium on your insurance. And it's no good you saying, but why? They would just say, those are the odds. That's the empirical truth. That's the epidemiology of accidents, if you like, is...
This is a tremendously interesting example because the knock against religion is that we can't see the rationality. And this is part of the reason why he is less reactive to religion than, let's say, a rationalist like Dawkins or Harris, because he says, I just look at the data and sort of like the insurance actuarial table, they seem to outperform. But then he's going to have to live with that. And that's where we get back into data narrative, because he's chosen as a narrative and a non-religious path.
That people call Jordan, or more famously, of course, actors pay more. And you can then try and look for a reason, and that's a very valuable thing to do, of course. We all want to know the reason. But sometimes I think there is a beauty in testing and looking and seeing and trying things out and experimenting. It's not to discard reason. The two go together in terms of finding out the truth.
So how do you associate that with your interest in literature and your clear recognition that the dramatic end of existence is...
He says dramatic, not dramatic. I got to leave that alone, but it's just, it's just peculiar.
Valuable.
Well, I suppose it's, in an obvious way, all literature people, literature snobs, I might say, will look at politics. All through my life, I've looked at people like, Margaret Thatcher, or indeed, on the other side, Gordon Brown, and thought if only they read Shakespeare. Why do people read books of political philosophy and books on this being a good idea, on, how parliamentary history, without actually reading about how humans behave?
Now, I love this argument. It's a powerful argument. And his argument is, if you read literature, but isn't literature, and this is an argument Peterson makes often, he says, in a way, literature is more real than a life. And in some ways, it's an argument that's connected to the actuarial table argument, that in some ways statistics are more real than individual performance. And he's going to get into this a little bit later when he talks about, you know, the fact that you can make predictions about a community of people far better than you can make predictions about one person. And that's a point that bears a lot of contemplation. But his, you know, again, he just said, and I'm not trying to straw man him at all, but in terms of this argument about bias, Shakespeare in some ways is already rationality built into it. It's just, and this is going to get into a mouse example that he has later on, it's just preconscious, non-intentional mice. Because again, as Peugeot, the point that Peugeot makes to Benjamin Boyce, if you set out with all of your archetypes and use that to frame your story, it's probably not going to be a very good story. So then you say, well, where does the story come from? Well, there's a good question.
And seeing how evil and good are played out in drama, because I think not just literature, but ceremony and ritual are extremely important.
You know, but again, ceremony and ritual are the rationalized expression. And what's incredible is that this is for me one of Peterson's really compelling things, is that sort of like Shakespeare's stories arise out of Shakespeare's experience, but he cannot say from where. And ritual arises out of the practice, the work of the community. That's what liturgy is, the work of the people. They arise out of the work. They are, in some ways, liturgy and ritual are the rationality of the subconscious, of the unconscious, of the collective. That's what they're doing.
In understanding everything, and you don't have to be religious to believe in ritual. I love liturgy. I love church liturgy. I'm absolutely passionate about hymns and psalms and the Eucharist and the language of it.
So as we try and get a sense of Fry, we would say he's perhaps biased against intentional self-conscious liturgy. Rationality, that's what he calls it. But he is a fan of unintentional, emergent rationality. We won't call it maybe it's not rationality because we're not using our rational faculty. It simply emerges. And again, when he later on gets to this example about the mice, this will emerge. And that's why, you know, I thought about just jumping to the end of this conversation with one of the really hot stuff. But again, after seeing the whole conversation, going back and listening to it now, I can begin to see where the seeds are sown of what will come into full bloom later in the conversation.
You know, the outward and visible sign of an inward and visible grace is one of the most beautiful phrases I think ever written in the book of the Eucharist of the Episcopalian Church, as Americans call it, or the Anglican Church, as we call it. And there are magnificent shortcuts available if you look at ceremony and the dramatization of human issues, rather than attempting to abstract some essence from them, some truth that you can say that is applicable to all.
But that is what the liturgy is. That is what, and again, I think what comes out of this is Fry is finally an intuitive and not a rationalist in his sense, which is, I take it all up into my conscious reason and I myself choose. In that way, he is the opposite of Nietzsche.
It's, in a sense, we're all children who have to be shown puppets before we understand. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? Yeah. I've stopped. Sorry.
No. Well, it's
no, Jordan's thinking. It's good. It's good. It
just stopped and made me think. I mean, the reason I got interested in religious thinking. I went down the pathway that you're describing. I mean, that's why I got interested in religious thinking, because from a psychological perspective, I mean, the first thing that I realized, and I believe this is what you just pointed out, is that there are truths embedded in fiction, for example, or in spectacle, ritual, drama.
Okay, those truths are, that's the narrative part. And again, these are embedded, not, we're going to sit down and we're going to, the liturgy sort of emerges, not, it emerges through an individual, but then through a community of individuals. But it is much more of an artistic endeavor, rational, that rather than, let's see, we might even argue that engineers are also subject to this, because science itself is always this practice of insight and then hunting down the data to support the insight, which is of course why it must continue to be tested back and forth.
And well, then you ask, well, what is it? Those are attractive and they're entertaining and they automatically engage our interest. But way more than that, they're also that which culture centers itself around.
Yeah.
Greek tragedy, for example, which seemed to be integrally associated with the Eleusinian Greek mysteries,
yes.
Something that we know very little about, unfortunately. But for me, and I was influenced by Carl Jung in this mode of thinking, culture is nested inside a narrative structure.
Now, having everything I said, and myself not knowing a lot about Jung obviously comes into the conversation here, because Jung, more than many, had this belief in this bubbling up that comes through.
By necessity. I even believe that science is nested inside a narrative structure, because the narrative structure is what makes the science practically applicable and useful.
Yes. What?
It's covering the eye. You need the manifest image in order to apply the scientific image.
What else is the standard model, but another way of saying a narrative structure? The standard model is just that. And that is the basis of physics today, isn't it? It's a story.
Well, and the idea that we have that science is a useful endeavor, the fact that we're looking to the material world for redemption, that's all part of a narrative. And
we're looking to the material world. This part of the conversation was really helpful for me. We're looking to the material world for redemption. We're not exactly sure. Again, let's push our friends the way we push our rivals. Redemption from what? Well, from all of this suffering, from all of this suffering. Okay, but we don't really want suffering to go away. What does redemption look like?
I was absolutely staggered by Jung's analysis of the emergence of science out of alchemy. And his notion was that the alchemical tradition was a 2,000-year-old dream, a narrative dream, a counterposition to Christianity.
Now, dream, it's, having listened to Peterson long enough, when he says dream, see, you can use the word myth and dream both dismissively, and that would come from the left brain. Okay, Gilchrist, what Stephen Fry will call the rationalist. But a dream is an image, it's a vision, it's something which motivates and draws us. And that's, so when we say redemption, well, there's a dream.
With its emphasis on abstract narrative dream, a counterposition to Christianity with its emphasis on abstracted spirituality, suggesting that what we lacked could be found in the depths of the material world.
So it would be a dream, first prompted in a garden that may be whispered by a serpent that you have enough stuff down here below to build a tower to the heavens.
And that was, and so there was this motivational dream that if we paid enough attention to the transformations of matter, we could find that which would confer upon us eternal life, infinite health, and wealth.
now we have to, eternal life. Let's see, now we have to we're going to have to, not only do we must borrow from heaven the images we attempt to construct from the stuff here below.
And Jung's point was, well, until that dream was in place, there would be no motivation to undertake the process of the painstaking analysis of the material world that didn't produce any immediate gratification.
And you could look at that in terms of the scientific method, because at first the scientist has the insight that's some sort of analogous to the dream, and then he does all the work to try to say, okay, can this dream be constructed? That's all the motivation to go down and dig it up out of the matter of the earth.
And it took thousands of years for that idea to assemble itself with enough force so that we could start to have scientists. So the narrative was operative thousands of years before the technical process was instituted, and it laid the groundwork for it. And I found that highly credible.
And maybe also took that time for the brain of humans, if you believe Julian Jaynes, and I kind of do in a metaphorical way. I don't know if you know his book.
Yes, I do.
I'm sure you do, yeah. That maybe, our brains weren't even capable of processing in that way.
Messed up my recording just a little bit because I didn't know who Julian Jaynes is. So let's not be so proud of ourselves that we can't admit, who are you talking about? Julian Jaynes. February 27, 1920 to November 21, 1997, was an American researcher in psychology at Yale and Princeton for nearly 25 years and best known for his 1976 book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And we're knocking on the McGilchrist door again. His career was dedicated to the problem of consciousness, the difference between what others see of us and our sense of our inner selves and the deep feelings that sustain it. Men have been conscious of the problem of consciousness almost since consciousness began. Do we have documentation on that? That seems like a long time ago. Jaynes' solution touches on many disciplines, including neuroscience, linguistics, psychology, life, born in West Newton, Massachusetts, career and motivations, publications and thesis. So, the Iron Age collapse, speculated by Jaynes to have been the ultimate cause of the breakdown of bicamerality. I'm sure some of you in the comment section will know way more about this than I am, but at least now we know who we're talking about. And a little bit later in the conversations, Peterson's basically going to say, not impressed. So,
if you believe Julian Jaynes, and I kind of do in a metaphorical way. I don't know if you know his book.
Yes, I do.
I'm sure you do, yeah. That maybe, our brains weren't even capable of processing in that way around the time of between language and writing, that sort of time. We were finding ways of describing the world to the Egyptian. I believe I'm right in saying this is the derivation. El-Chemet, the magic, became alchemy, which then became chemistry, and it became drilled down into an investigation. But first, you had to believe that there was a chemet, there was a magic inside everything, inside substance, to which we could be tuned.
Yes, right, a redemptive magic.
Yes, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Fry is agreeing with what Peterson just laid out in his sort of a different pathway to get there from Peterson and Jung.
And this is not to repudiate science and numbers. And, a very good friend of mine who was a priest said, physics is a theology that makes machines work.
That's really clever. Physics is a theology that makes machines work. That's really clever.
And there's some sort of truth in that. And I love, for example, the story. I tell it in a footnote in Mythos, but it's very, very early on in Greek mythology, when the primal entities, the primal deities are Uranos, the sky, or Uranus, as children we love to call him, and Gaia, the earth, who mate. The sky and the earth mate is a common theme in what they call a mytheme in lots of different myths, as you can imagine. The sky and the earth mate, and they produce whatever is in between the zone.
And, that's Part of why I say I don't know that we're going to get rid of any two worlds mythologies, because they're all over the place. But now, of course, in the Christian story, there is the God that makes the earth and the sky, and so on and so forth.
Which we inhabit between sky and earth, and that next generation are called the Titans, of course. But and there's the famous story of the birth of Zeus. His father, the Titan, eats all his children, and the mother Rhea is determined that the last child, Zeus, shouldn't be eaten. So she goes and gets a rock from close by where she lives on Mount Orthrus, and she covers it in swaddling and hides it under her legs, and then makes the noise of childbirth. And Kronos, the Titan, comes, thinks it's a new baby, swallows it whole, and the actual baby is then born on Crete and becomes Zeus, the leader of the next generation of gods. But the stone she takes is from Magnesium in Greece, which is near Thessaly. And it's a stone that the Greeks had noticed had a very extraordinary property, which is the most interesting property that any object can have on Earth and is very rare, and that it can attract things remotely from a distance, that without there being a physical force connecting them, apparently, a piece of fluff or paper could fly towards this stone from Magnesium. And so stones that have this property are named after that part of the world. They're called magnetites, and from magnetites we get magnets. And the story of magnets and how magnets were then joined by Thomson and Faraday and others to make and Maxwell to make the electromotive force that allows you and me to talk the way we do, and to use that action at a distance, which science is brilliant at turning into extraordinary magical machines. The Greek for at a distance is tele, so it's telecommunication, telephone, television, and teleporting, anything that goes from one distant, telegrams and and so on, telegraphs. And that is and gravity is the same thing. Something moves and there's nothing between it, and it makes us thrill. And science can do that. And what we've never found a way to do is, or at least what we try to find a bit, is to do the same with our fellow people. But our fellow people are, the world is surprisingly stable. There's magnets around the place, and there's gold and there's stuff, and you dig it up and you can do terrible damage to it, as we have. But we have moved from small groups, to clans, to tribes, to nations, to this strange myth of a nation and so on. And the individuals within it are much less controllable than the objects around us. And yet we can control those objects so superbly that it gives us an idea that we have a special place and a special power.
It does give us that idea. And now maybe we say, well, okay, so there's the data that, well, there's all of this data that we're different from everything we see. And it gives us this idea, well, let's not get this idea. That would be rationality too quickly. But to resist the idea would also be rationality, because intentionality is built into an embraced and articulated bias.
And it's, I suppose, really what we want to do is to reconnect ourselves to the same motive forces that are thrilling, like magnetism and electricity, that exist in also all throughout nature, that we look at. Which of us can't honestly almost sob with joy when spring happens, and you see that once again these leaves are being pushed out of dead branches,
And as he's going to say a little bit later, but the animals don't sob with joy when spring happens. They just act.
Blossoms there and insects are flying towards them. There's this.
And so it's, see, this is, so on one hand, it's almost, well, why are we so awake that we notice our separation from Sister Nature? But you cannot sob with joy at watching her unless you are separate from her, because nature herself doesn't sob with joy at springtime.
Fantastic process going on. And somehow we've allowed ourselves to feel outside it, as if we are special. We've given ourselves a...
But again, you can't look at it without being outside it. We can't see ourselves, and we see each other.
Godlike status, which is very dangerous, I think, and very foolish. And
there's this bias.
And the more I look back, the more confidence I have in looking forward. I suppose that's one of the other reasons I love myth so much.
So, okay, so all right, so you described yourself as an empiricist, and then you started to talk about the attraction that the mythological and narrative world has for you, and some of the reasons for that. And then, but you also differentiated between you and Dawkins to some degree. And so, well, I'm curious about why.
Oh, I mean, I'm as I said, I can't speak for him, but you used the word rationalist,
and I understand
originally,
that.
and I don't have any particular points of disagreement with him. I'm really fond of him. He's a friend, and I only feel sorry sometimes that, and this is a cheap point. It's, you know, well, most of us are a bit fed up with this attitude that it's all about presentation. And I could argue that Richard's presentation, his passion is real. His love of science is real. His love of the joy and the wonder of discovery is real. He's written books on wonder, which is a huge and marvelous and much underexplored human quality.
And a primary religious...
Books on wonder. Okay, well... To naively experience wonder is wonderful. To take a step back and observe wonder, and to study wonder, is it as wonderful as being in the wonder itself? You know, it's a really remarkable little turn when, you know, we have this, and again, I'm not trying to kneecap him or anything in this, because this stuff is really hard, but it's built. I mean, the religious rulers say to Jesus at the triumphal entry, "Reign in your disciples." And Jesus says, well, the rocks would cry out. It's built into us to have this part to play, to celebrate the creation, because it's glorious, and we can not only in our ability to notice glory is intensified. And he's right that self-consciousness can get in the way, but this is a deep piece of all of this.
This instinct.
Yes, and yet science has shown us, and it really just can't be contested, that we are part of a continuum of life. DNA demonstrates this. The DNA we share, not just with our close ape-like and other mammals, but also with plants and flowers that also have DNA. And as we know, so do viruses. And yet, or RNA, and yet, I think it's fair to say that blackbirds don't look at the sunset and go, my God, that's so beautiful. Did you see that? I want to paint it. I want to remember it. How is it? You know, this.
And wouldn't it be a shame to have sunsets uncelebrated? There is something to this celebration. There is something to this creation. This is something to this second-orderedness. That okay, the data is the sunset. It ought to be celebrated. C.S. Lewis, praise is inner health made audible.
The sense of literally of marveling. It's the only world we know. When we're born, we don't think, of course, there are 70,000 other globes with much better sunsets. This is the only thing we've ever seen, and yet it staggers us. It surprises us. We're surprised by what is the case, to use the phrase that Wittgenstein loved. The case is everything around us.
Now, interesting because it's the case. We're staggered by it. Isn't this the motivational joy? You know, I often tell this story about glory, that glory can be diminished. Let's imagine the world's best pastry chef makes a cake. And the glory of that cake is multiplied when, let's say, the chef puts it before a group of people anonymously and just watches, and someone picks up the cake, and when you watch their eyes light up. The glory that is in the cake is sort of potential, but it's when it comes into contact with a conscious, a living, breathing enjoyer that the glory is manifest. Now, the glory would be diminished if it's the same cake and the same baker comes and says, well, I made that cake. Isn't it good? It's good, isn't it? It's good. Isn't this the best cake you've ever eaten? And so what does the maker of the cake do? Stays hidden, stays anonymous, and says, here it is. Here's the sunset. Here's the hummingbird. The hummingbird is not in awe of its hummingbirdness. My daughter adopted a little cat, and we have hummingbirds in the backyard, and I watch the cat, has aspirations of catching a hummingbird. Maybe one of these days it will. And I look at the hummingbird and its glory, but I look at the cat hunting, the honey, stalking the hummingbird and its glory. And glory is found in strange places.
And we don't know another one. And yet...
He's just setting up C.S. Lewis here.
We go, wow. Why should we go, wow, at what is absolutely ordinary? There must be a reason, I suspect, that we are astonished by the everyday, by the fact of what we see when we look out of the window or when we go for a walk. We're astonished by buds and grass and rabbits and sky and clouds. And these things are
But we're astonished.
Yeah.
We're astonished by what we want to imitate.
Yeah. That's
and I've thought about that idea for a long time. It's not a casual response to your question.
Yeah.
Well, the sun is a hero. The sun is the hero.
You just get the sense from this part of the interview that Fry is just not going there with him.
That fights the darkness at night and rises anew in the morning. The sun is associated with consciousness. Yeah. And we have to imitate the hero. Yeah. And we see what we have.
Where's that have to come from? We want to. Something in us longs to
imitate everywhere. And it reduces us to a state of awe. And awe is an invitation to imitate. And imagine, so you see what you are not yet, but what you could be. Mm. And you need to see that because you need to turn into what you could be, because what you are is not sufficient to redeem you.
Well,
and we got to get at this redemption.
I see that from a Jungian point of view, but and a Joseph Campbell-y sort of way too. But in terms of the way
Joseph Campbell-y, he's sharp.
Way myths and then religions developed, the idea of imitating these symbols of complete power and creation, like the sun, whether it's Ra or whether it's Apollo or any other deity or sense of solar greatness, you are supposed to supplicate or sacrifice to or acknowledge your weakness to, but not
we could
imitate.
Look at sacrifice. Look at sacrifice. That's a great inward point. Mm. So I ask my students, especially the children of first-generation immigrants.
Hmm. And you can see him ask it if you watch his lectures, because those are some of his best videos online.
What did your parents sacrifice to put you here? And they can answer that instantly. And sacrifice, like we look at ancient sacrifice and we think about it as something primordial or even detestable, especially in its more extreme forms, and no wonder. But we had to act out sacrifice before we could psychologize it and understand it. And what we learned, and this is absolutely crucial, this issue of sacrifice, what we learned was that if we gave up something that we valued in the present, and so that could be a false idol, that's one way of thinking about it. If we gave up something in the present that we valued, the future would improve. We learned that we could bargain with reality itself by sacrificing counterproductive values.
Now, notice what we're doing. We see the sun and we aspire to something in it. We see the glory in nature, and it wells up in us an inspiration to, and I think, okay, so the redemption. Well, what is this redemption that we are inspired towards? And I know Jonathan Peugeot, and he talked about theosis, and of course the Roman Catholics got triggered and said, "Hey, wait a minute, we believe that too." And of course the Protestants said, you know, we're there with the Apostle Paul. We long to be clothed with Christ. We long to be in Christ. We long to participate. The Protestants didn't say that because, dancing. We long to participate. Lewis said it this way, participate in the dance. And sacrifice is something that, and now I think Fry will diminish it in a few minutes, but sacrifice is something that pulls us towards it, and how can we see it, and we approach it relationally. I've been thinking about this a lot, and this is a conversation I had with John Vervaeke a couple of years ago, and I talked about it in my probably inscrutable video that I posted earlier this morning with some of my Sunday leftovers. But it's this argument that I've made that continues to grow in strength for me, that I borrow Pascal's spirit of geometry and spirit of finesse. We posture ourselves towards the glory-filled natural order in an inquisitive, curious, appreciable way, that we approach it with the spirit of finesse, not the spirit of geometry. Now, science has made a lot of geometry out of nature, and productively so in many respects. Remember, our nature is not our Lord, she is our sister. And so we are to, in many ways, we are to partner with her. We're not to abuse her. We're to collaborate with her in the larger product of glory. And that involves sacrifice. And our sister makes sacrifices, and we sacrifice with her in order to achieve the glory that is built into both of us. If you look at the man and the woman in the garden are not idle, they are gardeners. And if there's anything that gardening is, it is the mutual sacrifice between ourself and our sister in order to produce more glory. If you go into a supermarket, you find big red apples that are glorious. How did that glory come about? It came about with a mutual cooperation between us and her sister from the implicit tiny little apples that once were. I was listening to, I've been listening to so much lately because so much good stuff has come about. Oh, it was The Rest is History, Aztecs. I got to now look up the author. Camilla Townsend, The Fifth Sun. She was talking about, there's a question, why were the Aztecs thousands of years behind the Spanish when the Spanish came? And that whole idea has fascinated me. I may very well do an episode just on that conversation. And I ordered the book, and yes, I order way too many books, more than I have time to read, especially since Jordan Peterson is back on the scene. I had lots more time to read books when he wasn't putting out videos like he is. Not that I'm helping you, but why were the Aztecs so far behind? Well, you can read Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Well, you sort of require the agricultural revolution. Well, what does the agricultural revolution require? It requires having the flora and fauna available to you that can facilitate an established life. And it took a long time for corn to be sufficiently domesticated with peas, let's say, or legumes, or they needed to be able to grow and sustain enough plant enough plant protein to afford established agricultural communities. The Americas had another problem of so few domesticatable animals. And hunting doesn't allow you to, forces you to stay on the move. And so all of these things are part of this march to glory, whereby corn is a very different thing than it was. So this march to glory has taken a while
to move ahead. And so we acted that out long before we could make it into a psychological truism. And so there is that supplication element, but it's also the case that you should be prostrate in some sense in front of what's ultimately ideal, because otherwise you don't have the proper humility.
And I'd love for him to go more into that, because proper humility for what? Is it instrumental? Is it pragmatic? Or is it even deeper, that something in us knows we are a little lower than the angels, and so we prostrate ourselves even before them? Every time an angel shows up in the Bible who isn't coming in incognito, everybody hits the floor.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, I see what you're saying. Again, it makes rational sense, but then the empiricist in me says, well, okay, I'm the mother of some of those children in Mexico who are being slaughtered to the gods in order to make the harvest better. And lo and behold, it doesn't work.
Okay, now things get interesting, because this is, of course, the great complaint of the Enlightenment, which is, well, it doesn't work. And now, to double down on his empiricism, how do you know it doesn't work? Is it a question of time? Because, and this is where the evolutionary biologist and the evolutionary psychologist would say, now, wait a minute, if in fact this repeated pattern throughout history doesn't work, why is it still there? It might not work in your lifetime. It might not work in the individual case, but what if it scales and is necessary for the civilization? And Fry himself will make the point a little later, we can't predict what one man does, but we can sort of predict another. What if this working is on a different scale than the woman and her prayers and not losing, and for the most part, again, if you listen to that episode, mostly men were sacrificed to the gods, and often those who lost the war. And this is a repeated pattern all over the world, because if you lose a war, you either become dead or you become slave, which is analogous to dead. So,
because there is no causal relation between sacrificing children on a pyramid in Texaquatl.
That is a rational argument, Mr. Empiricist. That is rationality speaking. That is the left brain with a conclusion, rather than the right brain that says, I wonder if there's a relationship. And again, an evolutionary psychologist would say, if there is no relationship, why is the pattern so reliably reproduced? And we might say, well, we've given it up and we're doing just fine. And then, of course, the answer is, well, for how long? Well, I don't know. The future is open. Well, there you go. It's not a deal breaker. It's not a closer, but the right brain keeps you wondering, while the left brain says, nope, I'm sure.
And the harvest improving. In fact, there may well be an earthquake the next day and more people die. That very often did happen in whole civilizations. Mayan and Mexican and others disappeared. And the more
But why did, I mean, if this is such a catastrophic thing, why did it persist? See, that's the haunting evolutionary question. In that, surely, why were the Greeks conquered by the Romans? The Romans were more religious than the Greeks in some ways. The Greeks are about the only sort of atheistic people we can find until the Christians, who, ironically, and I would say that in Christianity we begin to, you might say, okay, well, there's going to have to be a balance here. Too much sacrifice is going to undermine you. Too little sacrifice, well, we don't know. How is this modulated?
They were threatened, the more they sacrificed and the less use it was. So there was no... It may have had a psychological purpose that I don't know. I mean, it seems to me the psychology of sacrificing your children or even your very rare cattle upon which you may depend for a year to eat to gods who will apparently placate you by making a better harvest or not.
And again, surely there were people who loved their children too much to sacrifice them. Surely there were people who loved to eat more than to sacrifice their cattle. Why didn't those tribes thrive and outcompete those who sacrificed? And then why is Christianity in its early period considered atheistic? Because they're not sacrificing. Well, what happened to their sacrifice? Well, it was psychologized in many ways. Well, okay, so are we just putting sacrifice behind us? Well, not if you listen to everyone saying that we must sacrifice in order to what? We must sacrifice the vision of our faces. We must sacrifice the health of our arms. We must sacrifice. We continue to be called to sacrifice.
Send a tidal wave this year that will destroy the port and all the other things that our ancestors found in the contingent world in which an unstable world in which they lived.
Be careful with that tsunami example because of Brett Weinstein and his example of the Boxing Day tsunami, because that religion saved its people and the skeptics drowned.
So I can understand why a 19th century figure like Fraser or in the Golden Bough or like Mary McCarthy or Jung or Joseph Campbell can make wonderful myths out of myths. They're telling a story about stories and telling us what they mean. Well, I don't refute it. I repudiate it. I allow myself to believe, no, actually, yes, it's all very well, and you can build a very nice theory about what these myths mean and who these heroes are and what these quests are and how there are only 7 stories and yes, but again, the stand-up comedian type empiricist in me says, okay, so I'm a small Roman person under those circumstances, and what is this really meaning to me? I'm sorry, no.
Meaning to me. What about us? Well, us is a function of that narrative too.
I've got, as Wordsworth put it, it's getting and spending and doing and having children and looking and hoping life gets better. And
now, right there, and I think this is where we're going to. This is where I see the conversation gets interesting, and we're going to get back here towards the end of the conversation a little bit later, a lot later. We've got a whole nother hour to go. These videos take so long because I think this is where Fry winds up. He's one of these people that I think at the bottom there's a meaning crisis, but he's happy and contented enough in the feelings of wonder to not long for the kingdom that the wonder points to.
Enjoying life with my friends, but
is it Epicurean?
To erect it into a spiritual language and a theater of human meaning is delightful and
unreasonable.
But I think we have to recognize that it's a game to some extent. It may be.
There's that left brain conclusion. And again, it's back and forth.
It may indeed be true. I mean, I'm not saying this to demolish your argument, but I'm saying it's yes, but, in terms of sacrifice.
The buts are important.
Yeah.
The buts are important. And the skepticism is necessary because you don't want to leave anything standing except that which can't survive the onslaught.
Yes.
And there's no doubt that the sacrificial idea can go dreadfully wrong. And but I would say that that's in the nature of of the attempt, because it's obviously the case that sometimes you make sacrifices towards a certain end, which is clearly an attempt to bargain with the future as if it's something that can be bargained with.
Yes, but
sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't.
And later, after that, the cultures of sacrifice.
What do you do when you bargain with the future? You approach it with the spirit of finesse. You approach it as if it is personal. That's what you're doing. That's the spirit of finesse. And we do that with people because we don't do it with populations, because populations are in that way not personal the way individuals are.
Sacrifice around the world, there came a new system where it was the gods who sacrificed themselves, which is like the Christian myth, or many of the dying and reborn kings in various myths that James Fraser in particular wrote about. And there Christ ransomed himself, as it was. So suddenly it's as if humans said, this sacrifice is getting us nowhere. If God really loves us, he would sacrifice himself or herself for us. And that is one of the meanings of the incarnation and the Christian story, is it not? And it's not unique in any way. There are many other stories of divine figures being sacrificed to save the society in which they make themselves flesh.
And he sort of forgets here what myth is for. Of course, Lewis would jump in and say, yeah, but this isn't like all the other myths. This is saying that someone acted out the myth and something different happened. And, well, what different happened? Well, we all imbibed this myth in a deep way, and it changed our context of thinking. We're going to see that a little bit later.
You sacrifice your short-term impulses for the long-term good. I suppose that's one way of thinking about the discovery of the future.
That speaks very well to your books. That speaks very well to your books, because underlying both your excellent books,
but you do have to ask why it works.
Of rules of behavior is that I don't mean this in a bad way. The simple truth of deferred pleasure being something that seems to be, or deferred advantage being something that seems to have gone out of human culture lately. That we're all a bit Veruca Salt. I want it now,
Willy Wonka reference.
And as you said about sacrifices, you suffer, or you find in some way you defer what pleasure might positively be yours now in order to have a future advantage. Yeah.
Right. And then we have an immense discussion that lasts forever about what that optimal future advantage is. And that's part of this religious investigation, because you might say, and this is something that's manifesting itself in Christianity, which is, well, we're trying to produce something better in the future. And so then you ask yourself, what does better mean? That's the first question. And what does the future mean? Those need to be answered.
And what us is participating in it. Individualism has a real problem there. My children. Okay. Which children? My genetic children, or the children who are believing my thoughts after me? Are those my children? Are they brothers and sisters in church, or are they brothers and sisters in biology and genetics?
Answered. And then the final question is, well, what's the most appropriate sacrifice? And so you get an extreme version of that in Christianity, hence its narrative power, which is, well, you sacrifice the most valuable possible thing for what's of ultimate eternal value. That's the underlying structure. And
because if a human is the most valuable, well, then a God-man would be the most valuable human to sacrifice.
In some sense, it hits a limit, because it's God himself who's sacrificed. And the purpose of the sacrifice is the establishment, the redemption of humanity, and the establishment of of the kingdom of heaven eternally. So that there isn't anything better than that by definition.
No. Although
so
I know that if I was to raise Althusser or a Marxist view of this and say that it's about the power over the people, which basically denies them any kind of pleasure now on a promise which is unprovable of a future glorification in some kind or another, either for their children or for themselves in a heaven whose direction they can't point to.
What always amazes me about that argument is, okay, so what are you giving them? Well, they're going to rise up and take power themselves. Oh, that's the better path? How do you know? Because it's just as much a dream. Oh, they might die in the revolution. Okay. So suddenly, staying at home, the opiate of affluence, seems the most practical cause. And having known Christians all my life, when they get sick, they seek a doctor. If they don't have bread on the table, they go out and work. It's always sort of established like it's a zero-sum game that Christians, oh, I believe in God, and so I'm going to lay here flat on the floor until God raptures me. I just don't see a lot of Christians lying around. I see a lot of people lying around, but none of us would be confused that that lying around is necessarily their Christian virtue.
And not just Althusser and Marxists, of course, many secularists and atheists like myself have said, you know, there is a story to be told about religion basically stopping ordinary citizens from having any say in their life and their world.
Really? I don't see that much. Now, maybe it's because of the Protestant Reformation and Christians all sort of got activistic, but you know, again, I hear this complaint, but I don't see them. In fact, I often see it that once people, in fact, convert, then they start doing things like, and this is, you see this in Latin America, you know, once people sort of get into a personal relationship, then the man's money goes to the women and children, is vested in the household. And, you know, we've got the Weber thesis that, you know, Calvinism is responsible for capitalism. And so the argument that Christianity somehow results in some degree of passivity, that's the summation. That's your rationality. Where's the data? I don't see it.
They are told what the truth is. They are told where power comes from and where it resides. And they are told that their poverty and their subservience and their sacrifice are for the greater good.
And in almost every case, the subservience and the sacrifice doesn't change because the leaders change. It is their lot to sacrifice. And, you know, why did the West win? Why does Christianity flourish in places of sacrifice and poverty? Well, you know, if they could get out of poverty, and again, I worked among Haitians in the Dominican Republic, they worked very hard to get out of poverty, but they also at the same time believed they had a chance. Now, you might say, well, maybe that was that Christianity that told them they had a chance. Yeah, it was. But it also gave their suffering meaning, which just to say, well, there's actually no meaning in any of this, and the best we can hope for is our comforts and our distractions, because life has no meaning.
And they must take that authority on its word. And the meaning of the Enlightenment was the throwing off of those shackles of Aristotelian ecclesiasticism, which constantly laid down these categories of authority, and people began to question them and say, I wonder. Because a thing we might just talk about.
As if they didn't question before? I don't see the historical evidence for this rational story you're telling us.
Because I know it interests you, and there are people written quite a few books about it lately, is the distinction between a hierarchy and a network in terms of how you order society. And these religions and these sacrifices all came in hierarchical societies, rather, it seems, in ones that might be called networked, nodal, or some other word. I know Neil Ferguson has written about this, hasn't he, in a book that I can't remember its title. It's got the word tower in it. But it's one of the objections people have to the modern liberally produced world, is that morality is relative and that hierarchies are toppled and that power and authority are no longer seen to reside in something, in some agreed, the curtain is pulled away and the Wizard of Oz is revealed to be nothing.
Okay, so let's say most people who are stuck. Okay, there are real sociological, biological, physical corners that they are in. Two people stuck. One person believes there is some power at work in their stuckness, which will at some point justify the suffering that they must endure. And in many cases, these people who are stuck in suffering are tied to other people that are dependent upon them for one thing or another. So let's say you're a serf and you have a family and you know all you will likely ever be is a serf. So we have two serfs. We have a religious serf and an unreligious serf. The religious serf believes that, well, they both believe that they're probably going to be a serf until the day they die. It's probably going to happen that way. The religious serf believes that, well, there's a higher purpose at play and that their suffering actually will result in something better in this life and the next for themselves and their children. And so they continue to go forward in their suffering, believing that they do not labor in vain. The other serf says, this is futile. There is no reason. There is no purpose. What does that serf do? Probably nothing. Okay. Which serf endures? Why don't we have nihilistic serfs? This is part of the argument that Douglas Murray made. Why don't we have nihilistic serfs in history? I'm sure there are plenty of them. Why don't we hear from them? Because they didn't bother to write anything down. Because they probably didn't bother to reproduce. Because they probably didn't stay in the household and suffer in order to afford for their children at least the meager things they could afford. The nihilistic serf doesn't matter. They don't go anywhere. It doesn't seem hard to me to look at this and say, there appears to be an adaptive advantage to the religious because they endure and they procreate and they, at least to the limited degree they can, they educate their children. The nihilist cuts and runs and hopes for whatever tiny taste of redemption they can find, likely in momentary distraction. And again, this leads to the true rationalist, to let Stephen Fry off the hook. Well, if you can maximize your pleasure with cocaine, and you know that everything after your first hit of cocaine is the downside of pleasure, it's the cocaine and the bullet chaser. That's reasonable. Why does religion, why does Christianity afford a lift? Because the nihilistic serf doesn't write anything, doesn't support his family, doesn't produce anything that will actually endure in the history. And this is part of the reason I think that, for as delightful as Stephen Fry is, he's a product of affluence. Because I've known a lot of serfs, and they work hard, and they hope for a better future. And someone might come and say, let me tell you something. If you're an illegal Haitian in the Dominican Republic, well, they snuck over the border partly because they had hope for a better life, and they were Christians. You would even say their Christianity and the hope that was given them by religion spurred them on towards greater things that left an advantage to them and their children. So they outcompeted the imagined nihilists, because you just don't find that many of them, because they die and they don't contribute and they don't write very much. They're like the chaff. You know, that crazy video on my Sunday leftovers, Psalm 1. They're like the chaff that blows away in the wind. That's what the wicked are like. That's what the nihilists are like. They're like the chaff that blows away in the wind. Unlike the religious serf who labored and worked because they believed that even though in this world their labor might not result in anything, well, in tomorrow's world it did. It resulted in their children, which probably also suffered too. And on and on and on and on and on, to bring us to the world where Stephen Fry and I can live in the kind of affluence and luxury and abundance our ancestors could barely dream of.
A silly, foolish snake oil salesman. And the answer lies within ourselves, supposedly.
Okay, so I have to stop you there, because I can't answer. I won't be able to ask this question. Sorry, because there's so many things that you're saying that I want to ask about. There's okay. So, with regards to the idea of the opiate of the masses. Okay, well, the first thing we might note, I think reasonably, is that Marxism is the methamphetamine of the masses. And whatever flaws Judeo-Christianity might have had in terms of its corruption was certainly matched by the instantaneous corruption.
Yes, but the fact that a Marxist has a critique of religion does not mean that it falls because Marxism itself falls.
And that's a good point. But I would say that affluence is the opium of the masses, which is why Marx's inevitable revolution never happened, which led to the tyranny of Leninism.
No, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so that there's a second question there. And so the second question would be something like, is the corruption of the church that you described intrinsic to the nature of the church and its doctrine, or is it the corruption of something that's valuable? Now, let me make two arguments for that. One is that the corruption is intrinsic and the whole thing should be just dispensed with. And I would say that that's the perspective of the Four Horsemen, fundamentally.
Yeah. And and of religious people themselves. I mean, Thomas Cranmer, who wrote the prayer book during the Reformation, there's a great phrase in it: "There was not anything by the wit of man devised that hath not been in time, in part or in whole, corrupted."
And now we're seeing some Calvinism coming onto the scene, because the church recognizes in the church this problem. And so you have Reformation, and you have this continuity of Reformation. And I would agree with, I mean, Tom Holland starts Dominion all the way back in the Hebrew prophets, because he sees the pattern there, and it keeps going around. And so the church is always reforming and always taking these things into consideration.
Absolutely. And I think that's also an existential truth. I mean, you just talked about Kronos.
Yeah.
Kronos devours his sons. Well, Kronos is the archetypal tyrant, and he's also time. And both time and the archetypal tyrant devour their own sons. So if you're a tyrannical father or a tyrannical statesman, instead of encouraging the development of the young people in your charge, you crush them and destroy them.
He also castrated his own father.
So that's what time does too.
I would say that's something like demolition of the utility of tradition. I mean, in Egyptian mythology, you see Horus, who's the sun, fundamentally, both the actual sun, the heavenly sun, and the sun, and Osiris. And for the Egyptians, Horus and Osiris had to rule simultaneously. So Horus didn't castrate Osiris. He rescued him from the underworld and joined with him, so that the tradition, which was represented by Osiris, which had a Kronos-like element because it was tyrannical and destructive, had to be allied with Horus, who was essentially something like, I would say, something like empirical attention. It's because the symbol is the eye. And so it was like alert tradition. And that's different than the castration of the father. That's the rescuing of the father from the underworld when he becomes corrupt and senile. Now, when you just published Mythos, we referred to this Mythos, Heroes, and Troy. And so I would say, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but from the outside, it looks to me like you're involved in a philosophical, archaeological expedition to find things of value in the past and to bring them forward into the future. And that's what I am trying to do, at least for me, I would say, with regards to Christianity. It's like, I know the critiques and I understand the critiques, and it's not like I'm not, what would you call, sensitive to their finer points. It is an open question, right? How much of the tradition, look, I know in Britain right now, there are people who say that flying the flag is an imperialist act. And so what are they asking? They're saying, well, is our tradition so irredeemably corrupt that we have to abandon it wholeheartedly?
I can speak to this very directly because it's something I find very, very interesting. Again, so much of it is historical ignorance. For those who are obsessed with the flag and the politicians who want to fly the flag, I would urge them to read Rudyard Kipling, who is supposed to be, in some people's eyes, the poet and bard of British Empire, of the Raj, the spokesman for.
Oh, that cheap webcam that he has. Focus, focus!
For this very thing. There is a scene in one of his masterpieces, Storky & Co.
Get a Sony. Not a Sony webcam, but a Sony camera. Focus works really well, very fast.
A book set in a school where
I'm not sponsored by Sony in any way.
A politician comes to the school to give a speech, and he has a flag, and the school children are outraged, absolutely horrified. This takes place in the second year of Gladstone's 5-year premiership, at the absolute height of the British Empire. The Queen is on the throne. She's, her crown and her flag are fluttering all over the world. And these boys are at this special school, which is actually a kind of a feeder for the British Empire. They'll all be sent out to fight in Afghan wars and in India and in the Boer War later on. And Kipling describes how they die. But the idea to them that anybody would dare to wave a flag and ask them to value it was so disgusting they could barely speak. It's a very...
They were Protestants in their nationalism.
Extraordinary passage where he describes their horror at this politician using the flag and claiming to own it. He makes the point that one's relationship to one's country is intensely private. And it may be that one has great love.
It's all deeply Protestant.
For it, but that it's a love that is complex and confounded with all kinds of disappointment and hatred and fear and shame, as well as love. And it is one's own thing. But to fly it and to wave it and to say that it means this is a lie and an imposition on the personal experience of those boys in that story. And I would urge everyone to read that because it comes from a surprising source. It's no accident that the best writers...
Would you say the same about burning it? Is it the same kind of... Because you just offered a balanced account because you said, well, if you're sensible, let's say, and that your feelings for your country, so let's say your feelings for your tradition or your regard for your tradition is a complex mix of emotions from abhorrence and shame and contempt to love, that entire distribution. Okay, that seems to me to be appropriate. And my sense is that that's expressed mythologically by two figures of tradition, one, the wise king, and the other, the evil tyrant. And all cultures are a meld of both, although to a greater or lesser degree, because you get pure forms of tyranny and pure forms of benevolent rule. Okay, hopefully. I think that's a reasonable proposition. Okay, so it's complex, but you're willing to accept that complexity. But what I see, and maybe this will tie us back into the political discussion that we sort of started this off with, is that
and you never got back to. Thank you.
In radical movements, radical critical movements, and I think I place the atheist horseman in that category. The love is not there. The respect is not there. The pointing out of the flaws is there and the contempt is there. But the attempt, that's not good enough. Look, if you read a piece of literature.
You can't simply deconstruct. You have to offer. and they don't have anything to offer. And I would say Stephen Fry offers not much more. Well, there's entertainment. There's tut-tut. Well, that doesn't help the surf either.
You want to dismiss that which is no longer relevant and extract out that which is crucial.
Yeah.
That's critical reading.
Yeah.
But the purpose isn't to dismiss.
No.
Fundamentally, the purpose is to mine.
No. And I would say,
and to build.
Another very central piece of literature for me, higher literature than Kipling, most people would say, is one of Flaubert's short stories, Un cœur simple.
Now pay attention that he just said higher, because that's going to come up in a few minutes.
A Simple Heart, which is about this poor peasant woman, Félicité, I think her name is. And there's a scene in which she kneels in front of a stained glass window, and this is where the parrot comes from that Julian Barnes wrote about so brilliantly in Flaubert's Parrot. But she's incredibly simple and incredibly ignorant and uneducated, but also incredibly devout. And she kneels there with her knees up in desperate pain because she spends her whole life on them, scrubbing floors. And she sees
a lot of floor scrubbing in this. Mrs. Buttons, I think it was.
This extraordinary stained glass. And Flaubert is able to describe the incredible corruption and venality that went into the spending of the money on this stained glass and the lives of the corrupt priests who did it, but also showed the light.
That stained glass should have been spent on the poor. Who said things like that?
Coming from her rather than from behind the glass. It's a very holy moment. And it's anybody who dismisses religion would be well to remember that devotion and piety can be wonderful things as well as terribly brutal things. And,
okay, so I want to read something.
You must understand the difference.
Right. Okay, I'm going to read something, and forgive me. But
no.
I want to go here. You're face to face with God.
This must be something he wrote. Fry wrote.
Bone cancer in children. What's that about?
I wish Peterson had said what he's reading from, because both of them know and I don't.
How dare you?
And you in the comment section, I'm sure will tell me tomorrow.
How dare you create a world where there is such misery? That's not our fault. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world so full of injustice and pain? And then one more. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac.
Get a little nasty here.
Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov.
Now, let's take that, and we've got the two serfs. We've got the one who's devout. Their knees hurt both because of the hard labor and because of their devotion in church. And you've got the other who's the nihilist. Which one would say something like that? It's the nihilist, right? Where does that lead? And that's exactly where Peterson's going to go there. Why is this adaptive in terms of evolution? One is a dead end. The other leads to a better world in the future for their children, for their grandchildren, for their neighbors, for everyone else.
Karamazov.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Right. Now it's in, okay. So
yes,
what happens in the Brothers Karamazov is that Ivan wins the argument.
Yeah.
But Elosia is the better person.
Completely so. And we love him.
So it's
a book everyone should read.
And so there's Peterson's point. Ivan is the nihilist. He wins the argument. Elosia is the better person who wins the life.
I would urge everyone to read The Brothers Karamazov because I do think it's a work of genius. There's a lot about Dostoevsky I really dislike because of his influences. Again, people who don't understand Dostoevsky think he's a champion of right-wing religiosity without understanding that he went through an extraordinary life experience to come to where he did come, and that his novels show his full understanding of all kinds of different points of view. But in terms of the dialectic of that issue about how there can be a God, I mean, I was answering a question that I was asked.
I know, and I'm not
And
trying. I'm not
course,
really not trying to put you on the spot.
My point is, I don't believe there is such a being. But if there
A being, that'd be a God number 2.
were, and he were the kind of being that has been worshipped and described by various religions around the world, monotheistic religions, then I would have many bones to pick with him. But of course, I don't believe there is such a thing. But
So what are you left with? Well, it's this impersonal universe, which cares not. And that's a very reasonable thing to believe. Reasonable. But it seems the nihilistic serf is like the chaff in Psalm 1 that blows into the wind. And it's the blessed is the man who does not walk in the way of the wicked, or remain on the road of the sinners, or sit in the company of the mockers. That's probably what we're dealing with here. But who delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on it day and night, because he is like the tree planted by the river that bears fruit in and out of season. That the believing serf bears fruit in fat years and lean years. What is that fruit? Bearing fruit for the family, for the children, for the neighbor, for the community. Not so the wicked. They are like the chaff, the nihilist. Lot's wife says, or Job's wife says, Lot's wife, she turns and looks. Job's wife says, curse God and die. That's what the nihilist does. End it now, Job. No, he's going to bear his fruit in lean years. And sometimes the fruit in the lean years is the most precious. It certainly gains the most money at the market because it's a lean year.
The argument from evil, as it's known, is a very old one, and it goes back through medieval religious figures as well as later humanists. That this idea,
it does change, and Tim Keller writes about this in his book on suffering. It does change after the Enlightenment. You can sort of find the older version in Job. You find the atheist version after the Enlightenment.
That it is very hard to square this loving God who has knowledge of every hair on our head.
But this squaring is the rationality. That's what's incredible about this conversation, is because we begin with this. Dawkins is a rationalist. I'm an empiricist. And he keeps going to the rationality with his summations, left brains. Maybe I should have done the McGill-Christ commentary first, because that's what this is about. It's about grafting. Well, now the McGill-Christ conversation is going to be infused with this conversation.
And adores us and adores little kittens, but he also, as I say, bone cancer in children, but also life cycles of insects whose whole aim is to burrow into the eyes of children in Africa.
Whose aim? It has no aim. You're borrowing from a meaningful universe to make your argument. It has no aim in your world. It just does. It's just the data.
And lay their eggs there and cause blindness for those children. I mean, you could quite easily picture a universe in which there weren't such an animal.
Is there glory in that animal? A kind. Even in that animal. And you might say, oh, but if there's a glory in that animal, let's imagine we had the power to, like, let's say, so, Rick is playing with Unreal Engine and playing around with my question and answer backgrounds and putting the Discord questions up in the chat and playing with this. Let's imagine that this animal could be eliminated from creation. Would creation be more or less glorious?
and in which children were not sent blind with pain and horror by the various bugs and fungi and insects and viruses in the world. It isn't necessary.
There's a worm in Africa that burrows under the skin, and it's a long worm. And if you can pull it out with a pencil and wrap it, but it breaks. It's fragile. And
all of this can be avoided with that rationality, religion-y stuff that we send youth down in medical brigades. We call them brigades to instruct people in the undeveloped world who are often terribly pious about invisible things that do them harm.
And then it gets infected. It's a terrible thing. And a doctor recently made it his life's work to eradicate that and did it successfully. Yeah. And so then I read what you wrote. And I mean, I take it.
So 3 cheers for intentionality.
Very seriously. And
what are you reading from, Jordan? Tell us. We want to enjoy the party too.
I wasn't throwing it in your face. No. I brought it up actually because of what you said about Flaubert's attitude. You know, because what your statement lacks is exactly what Flaubert highlighted in that woman on her knees. And I'm not saying this is a simple solution, right? And I would say, so let's take the argument you made there. And there's a direction that goes in that's nihilistic and resentful and vengeful and angry and all understandable. Yes. But to me, it doesn't look to me like there's anything good in it. It looks like it's entirely counterproductive.
It's counterproductive. It's like the chaff.
It makes the problem it purports to have been generated by worse. Mm-hmm. So then the question is, what's the appropriate attitude given that the argument you make is actually an extraordinarily powerful argument? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know, I think that resentment and anger, and even the motive that would make you want to say that to God himself, I think that's probably not helpful, even though it's so, well.
And helpful towards what? So the serf is bound. They have no chance. They're going to die a serf. I do talk about the Dominican Republic sometime, but so I go there and I realize that as missionaries, we can pluck a young person or two with potential and maybe send them to the States for an education and maybe save a family, but the lot of those Haitians might be improved slowly, but they're going to die. They're going to die poor. They're going to die forgotten. There was one old pastor who, because they didn't have any money, and part of the reason they wanted a relationship with me was because I had money, at least more than they did. I had a starting minister's salary, but there was more than they had. And so when one of them got sick, go look for the missionary and see if you can get something out of him. And so there's this pastor who's in and out of the hospital. And of course the hospital, not like a hospital here, in and out of the hospital, the kind of hospital that a Haitian could afford to get into. And it was money and money and money. And finally I said, okay, here's the money. Do you want to spend it on the hospital or on his funeral? The family said, we'll spend it on his funeral. Okay. And so he died. And I remember him in that wooden box. You'd bury people within 24 hours, but they already start to get a little puffy. And so I remember the pastor in the box, and they took a little hand iron, a little, weighted hand iron. This was an iron that you used, and people, it's not electric. You don't use electricity. It's iron. You stick it in the fire. It has some weight, and so you can iron your clothes with it. They put the hand iron on his stomach because he was already starting to blow. Those people had reason. They could celebrate and they could have joy. These well-meaning arguments about, oh, these deceived people who are imagining something better because of their prayer and devotion. Would you even take the celebration at a funeral from them? Because that's what you're doing. Now, most atheists are very kind, wonderful, lovely people. They don't go to a funeral and say, they don't do that. None of us do. Our manners are better than our rationality. And the point Peterson's about to make, I think, is dead on right. This is what he's learning as an empiricist, that he can't put it together, that, you know, bitterness won't help him.
I came to that with great difficulty. I mean, I've had my reasons to be resentful and angry, especially recently, and because I'm suffering a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And it makes me resentful and angry and wanting to shake my fist.
Yeah.
But I found upon intense consideration that there was nothing in that didn't make it worse, and that therefore that must be wrong. Even though it's just
Darwinian wrong. Peterson looks and says, that's like the chaff. It goes no place.
Justifiable, right?
Jordan, I completely understand. And you must remember that my response was to a question.
See, and now the atheist backs up. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm not trying to, well, why don't you well up in the suffering? And you don't do it because of this. Because somewhere all along the line throughout history, you learned that to mock the sufferer, to mock Jesus on the cross, you don't do it. Because, you know, a little later, Fry's going to make the point that people are awfully good. Yeah. How did they get good in this society? Where were these manners developed? Where does this deference towards suffering people, this kindness, this isn't natural to us. It was built into us by Christianity. That's Tom Holland's point in Dominion. We've arrived at this, and it's so evident around us that even this extremely articulate, brilliant atheist now is on his heels in the whoa, I didn't. You know, if you're going to be a nihilist, show up at the funeral and say, doesn't matter. No, you at least want to be a kind nihilist. Why? Why the kindness? That's Tom Holland's point. Why the kindness? And that's simply an assumed definition of a good person. And so Stephen Fry, you know, backs up before the suffering and says, suffering isn't just, Indifference is the way nature sees suffering. Not us. Not after Christ. You know, the dog doesn't walk by and, you know, well, I suppose the dog's licks Lazarus.
Question I didn't see coming, and it was amused. It was because I don't believe in this God. It's not an issue. I'm not really resentful and angry about the fact that there's evil in the world. I'm sorrowful.
There would be no one to complain to.
Very often, and I'm united in my admiration for the fact and the real belief I have that most people, fundamentally, given this dysfunction or this deep trauma, most people are so good, are so anxious to be good, are deontically good, have a sense of obligation and drive in them to be better than they are. I think that's that.
How did we get this way? Why is this in our value system? How did this happen?
It's one of the key things that I love about humanity is not just that we are dissatisfied with things that are wrong.
This is humanity when? See, he's all of his complaint about the data, too rational. What does he say? When he talks about humanity, it's up here. It's in the heavenlies. It's eternal. That's the yardstick that you use to measure. He uses it. He uses a Christian yardstick. Can't help it. You got no other yardstick. You look at the other yardsticks of the ancient world, and you say, no, that's not morality. That's not a moral yardstick.
Can be improved, but with ourselves we are dissatisfied, and that most of us want to be better.
And where did that come from? It's the Jews who, they believed their God ruled the world, and then Marduk and his armies, led by Nebuchadnezzar, came down and burned their temple, and they didn't say, oh, I guess Marduk's a better God, we're going to worship him. No, they said, oh, Lord, how have we offended you? Read the book of Chronicles. What have we done to deserve this calamity? If you believe there's nothing in the world, you say, nothing. Nothing. You haven't done anything wrong. There is no right or wrong. This whole idea that you now feel bad about yourself because the Babylonians kicked your butt, and everybody in the world knew they were going to kick your butt. They kicked everybody else's butt. But that you feel bad about it, well, that's just your own stupidity. Give up that God and follow Marduk.
I know that's true of me all the time. Every time I go off to sleep, I think, how did I screw up tonight?
You're so Christian. That's practically your prayer before you go to bed. I mean, it's built into you.
Today, how can I be better tomorrow? Why am I so bad at this? If only I could manage that.
Been reading the Hebrew prophets. They're just in everything that you've read.
In moral terms, genuine moral terms.
I think that's an extraordinarily common experience and very much under-noticed.
Yeah.
Jesus must have gotten in early and rewired us, whether we're going to church or not.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, as far as I can tell, that the talks that I've been giving, let's say, have had the effect that they've had is because I do point out that that's an extraordinarily common experience.
Yeah.
That self-torture by conscience. And it does indicate
you can send Jesus your royalties.
This striving towards a higher mode of being. And the other question I have when I look at the response that I just read is that the amount of the world's evil that's a consequence of our voluntary moral insufficiencies is indeterminate. So you might say, hypothetically speaking, that as part of God's creation, we actually have important work to do. And if we shirk it, the consequences are real. Yeah. And you might say, well, that's just an apology for God. And perhaps that's the case. And perhaps there's no God at all. And so what the hell are we talking about? But I do think it's an important issue. I mean, your life is characterized by a stellar level of constant productive creativity. That's you, and you're offering that to the world, and that seems necessary. And maybe it's because the problems are real and important, and the role we have to play ethically is of paramount importance, truly.
Yeah.
Why else would we torture ourselves with conscience? And I would say that's the flowering of the religious instinct within you.
Well, you could describe it as that, but then, there are phrases. I mean, you used a phrase earlier that I wanted to say, whoa, hang on, I'm not sure I know what that means, a higher mode of existence.
Wait. Remember a few minutes ago when you said of this other author that this was higher literature? And again, I hate to, do a little thieving from Jonathan Peugeot when he's sitting down with Jordan Peterson and Brett Weinstein and said, wait a minute. You're smuggling, you're stealing this from Christendom again. And you're not attributing it to this world, because where we're going to land, there is no high and low.
I don't see... I remember having this argument with John Cleese, of all people, some years ago. He was a great lover of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Gilbran and people like that. And
can't not laugh when I think of John Cleese.
And I've always found them slightly hard to take. And he talked about I think the phrase he used was a higher level of consciousness. And I said, I don't and again, this is my empiricist thing. It sounds cynical and skeptical. It's not meant to be, but what level? Who's at what? Describe a level. What is a...
And I'm with Fry here on the higher level of consciousness thing, because, but at the same time, he understands higher level of literature. Well, value. Go back to my conversation with Sevilla.
Higher mode. Why higher? What's higher than another? Are you saying it in terms of animals? It's a view, it's an old-fashioned Huxleyan view of evolution that most modern, Richard Dawkins, for example, most modern evolutionary scientists and so on, the ethologists would deprecate, to say that there is a higher level.
Deprecate is down.
Level of being, a higher mode of consciousness? Is it just like saying, well, you're better educated, you've read more, you know more? Is it you've somehow been enlightened, a Verklärungs effect, as the Germans would say, which is not necessarily intellectual, but is somehow spiritual? And if so, show me an example of it. Show me someone who has a higher mode of existence than I do, or the...
I can...
Isn't his argument that the devout person who suffers because they're on their knees scrubbing and they're on their knees at church is lower? I mean, I love the way Peterson put it in the Peugeot conversation, that, I mean, it's almost by definition that you have to have these things. And now I like where Peterson goes with this.
I can answer that, I think, to some degree. Three ways. One, that higher mode of existence is what your conscience tortures you for not attaining.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
I think what my conscience tortures me for not attaining is that I was rude to someone yesterday and I shouldn't have been.
Yes. Tell me about it.
Right, but it's the shouldn't part of it.
Yes, the obligation. It's the
exactly.
David Hume, the problem of ought. Yeah.
Well, and then you think about how it manifests itself. You don't. This is why Nietzsche was wrong. You cannot create your own values.
Right.
The values impose themselves on you independent of your will. Now, maybe well, that's what your conscience does, and good luck trying to control it.
This is very anti-Nietzsche, isn't it?
Well, I'm a great admirer.
I know you are. That's why I made the point. It's very opposite to his philosophy.
But so Jung embarked on.
Now, it's opposite to Fry too, because Fry is going to be very much not the will. Okay, and we're going to see that at the end.
A lengthy critique of Nietzsche, and it's part of his work that isn't well known, I would say. We'll leave that be, except to say that the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, well, not really, but popularized by Freud and systematized, showed that we weren't masters in our own psychological house.
Right.
There were autonomous entities, and those would be the Greek gods to some degree that operated within us, and we were.
Which is Julian Jaynes's point, exactly. Yes.
We're in. Yes. I have my problems with Jaynes, but as a overarching idea, there's interest in it. Okay, so there are things happen.
That's the best I can do right now. As an overarching idea, there's interest. That's about as far as I'm going to go.
Happening with us and to us in the moral domain that we cannot control.
Yeah.
And that stunned me when I first learned it as a proposition. It's, oh yes, look at that. Here's one. What are you interested in?
Yeah.
Well, that grips you. Okay. Number two, what does your conscience bother you about? Okay. You're inadequate by your own standards. Now, what adequate would mean, that's a different question, but it's defined negatively by conscience.
Yes.
And then better, there's one that I said I would lay out three. You can look at Jean Piaget's work on developmental psychology.
On the development of the subject, yes.
He was a genetic epistemologist.
Yes,
I'd love to hear Peterson talk more about Piaget. I think his stuff on Piaget, I don't know much about Piaget, but Peterson's stuff on Piaget really grabs me.
he wanted to do was, this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to unite science and religion. That was his goal. And he wanted to look at the empirical development of values. And what he concluded, at least in part, was that a moral stance that's better than a previous moral stance does all the things that the previous moral stance does, plus something else.
Yes. Yes.
And you can say the same thing as a scientific theory.
I remember I had a great, I loved Piaget, and his observation was so empirical, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the development of the child and not quite the theory of mind, that wasn't his thing, but similar developments and signposts where people become aware of self.
Okay, so now Piaget looked specifically at the development of morality, and he was one of the first people to emphasize the importance of games.
Yeah.
And what he showed was that at 2 years old, let's say, a child can only play a game with him or herself.
Yeah.
But at 3, both children can identify an aim and then share it in a fictional world. And so that's partly pretend play and the beginnings of drama, and then cooperate and compete within that domain.
Yeah.
And then what happens, and the game theorists have shown this, is that out of games, morality emerges.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example, and this is a crucial example. So if you pair
the rats,
juvenile rats together, they don't develop teenage rats. So then you say
map territory. Sorry to skip ahead. If you've never heard, anybody watching my videos has heard about Penksap's rats enough. That's a great example. I'm not getting away from the example. I just heard Jordan say it so often. I just want to fast forward to get to the next parts.
Power determines hierarchy.
Yeah.
Then if the big rat play.
Yeah. That theory of mind games that were devised by Simon Baron-Cohen and others in the question of showing how neurodivergence develops in the autistic spectrum, for example. But one of the things so interests me at the moment, because of the pandemic, which is slightly close to this, that you might be able to help me with, is I've been very interested in, as I have been over the years, at how completely out of favor B.F. Skinner and the behavioralists have become since a man you probably don't admire that much, since Noam Chomsky rather demolished B.F. Skinner famously. And
on the language front.
On the language front. But also the whole nature of behavioralism and looking at rats and their behavior has. But when it came to this pandemic, one of the things that was hidden from the public was that every country had its scientific committees, which were mainly composed, of course, of virologists and epidemiologists and immunologists. But
I'm watching this carefully, and he's hitting the table or something, and the camera's moving, and I'm a little seasick here. Hold the camera down.
Always behaviorologists too, because the secret to getting out of the pandemic wasn't just following science and tracking a microbe, an invisible virus in the air. It was how people would take it. And Sherlock Holmes in this,
and that's key, and this is very much, all of this stuff that Jordan talks about in terms of sacrifice, in terms of history, how the culture net gets into the genetics. I mean, it's all that movement between these two domains.
His second Sherlock Holmes book, which is called The Sign of Four, says to Watson, I remember this, it's very interesting. He says, Watson, the statistician has shown that we can predict to an extraordinary order of accuracy the behavior of the average man. He uses the word man, whereas now we would have to say human or man and woman, but you know what I mean. The average man. We can absolutely predict how they will behave, but no one has yet and probably never will be able to predict how an individual will behave.
Okay. Take that point and apply it to your point about religion not working. It's probably the same dynamic, and the peculiarities there. Go to go to the social data, and Vervaeke points this out to me all the time. He says, religious people perform better. They're happier, they're wealthier, they have more children. They outperform people without religious commitments. And even apart from, at least, see, and I would argue, at least to agree which religion, but I would argue that, in fact, Christianity via the West and what happened in the colonial period of it relativizing religions, and this is Tom Holland's point about India, that they didn't know they had a religion in India until the British came and named it for them. That something has happened by which, okay, and of course the British went to India and said, well, you may now no longer burn the widow on the pyre of her husband. Okay, you may now the British went around the world and did a lot of tinkering with things within limits. And religious people outperform non-religious people. And generally speaking, okay, in the numbers, do better. And I think that's an answer to, well, it doesn't work. I asked for God to heal my son, and my son didn't live. And, it's not like religious people don't know this. I'm a pastor. I pray for people who die all the time. And I pray, quite consciously, for their healing. Are my prayers not answered? Often. Do I stop praying? No. Do people ask me to stop praying? In fact, it is the rare atheist and secularist who will be offended or ask that I not pray. Part of the difficulty is to say, really? Stop me. I can do it with my eyes open.
So we can be talked about as a mass, and advertisers and politicians and psephologists and all kinds of other people are very good at knowing how we behave as a group. But as individuals, we are unknowable without face-to-face conversation and the history and so on. So that was one. And the other one, which I think is connected, was, I believe it was a B.F. Skinner experiment, and it's one I absolutely love because it makes me wonder whether all these kind of conversations are maybe ultimately a waste of time. But he said, if you take a load of mice and put them on a Perspex tray and float them on the water, because they are unaware of the risk they're in, they move around randomly. And their random movement makes the tray even. They're just randomly moving around.
Don't put any cheese on one end of the tray because they are unaware.
If you scale it up and put humans on it, they sink within seconds because they think, oh, we're tipping, we must run to this end. And
how did they actually do that experiment? Did they actually put a group of people on something? You see, and what's interesting about this story again is through the whole conversation, okay, if I am going to get rational about Stephen Fry's, the data at least I have in this conversation, and his anti-rationality, his point is consciousness. Let us be unconscious.
And of course, they all run to that end, and so it tips over. In other words, consciousness of the problem, attempting to deal with it, being aware of it, is the biggest problem of all. And that's something new to us.
It's very interesting how, so I was at a party and my son's girlfriend has a guinea pig because she lives in a little room and doesn't have a lot of space and kind of wanted a pet. And I said, get a guinea pig. We had guinea pigs when my kids were little. Guinea pigs are wonderful pets. They make delicious food for South Americans, but get a guinea pig. And so we're at a child's birthday party at this home, and there's some water around, and someone asked, can guinea pigs swim? I said, oh, yes. Because when my kids were little, we would put the guinea pigs in the tub with them, and you watch those little guinea pigs swim around the tub. They're pretty good swimmers. You know who can't swim? Great apes. All the rest of the mammals can swim. Why? What's this darn consciousness? But you never know that unless you have consciousness. And it goes all the way back to the question of praise. Why don't the guinea pigs pause at the sunset? Well, the guinea pigs are, they're from the Andes in South America, beautiful country. Why don't they pause and say, my, this mountain is majestic? Isn't that the delight? Isn't that what gives us our ability to appreciate and delight in glory, and then, as Jordan Peterson said, to ambitiously pursue it? I think it's connected to the nihilistic serf versus the religious serf. And again, you never heard of the nihilistic serf because you would never hear about him because he did nothing. He's like the chaff, blows away in the wind, Psalm 1. And those of you who are only watching this video, because a lot more people watch this video than my Sunday leftover video, and rightfully so, the video was kind of a mess because my thoughts were kind of a mess. But I wanted to get my thoughts down on Psalm 1. What about that? Blessed be the man who is not like the wicked and the sinner and the mocker or the scoffer, but is like the serious man who delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on it day and night. For he will be like a tree planted by a river that bears fruit, that brings forth fruit in and out of, in fat years and lean years. Blessed be that man. It's happy as that's a beatitude. Of course, Jesus will riff on the beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And the beatitude that Jordan Peterson gets wrong. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed is that meek woman there on her knees. What do you mean those Haitians will inherit the earth? They'll die. Yeah. But I believe they'll also rise again and inherit the earth. Oh, that story. Yeah. But in another way, as I said before, the nihilist doesn't inherit anything. They're like chaff. They blow away.
Because in the old days, we lived in small groups who just didn't know how awful humanity was.
And then finally, when we got the corn, like the Aztecs, and we were able to get in groups, and then we sort of sacrificed people on a mass scale.
What sins we were committing, how dreadful we were making the world. It was only through the telecommunications.
It's better if we sin and don't have any law. Now he's stealing things from the Apostle Paul.
Communication, and through the recent development of the global village, or whatever you want to call it, your countryman McLuhan, that
you Canadians.
We have actually become aware and are now likely to be running around in that tank and causing it to fall over. Whereas really we should just be unconscious and get on with living and randomly run about in our tank, and then we'll never sink.
Just stay in that basement and get covered with Cheetos dust and do some porn and play video games and let mom pay for the internet connection. Come on, Jordan. Rise up. Engage this battle. You can do it. I know you can. The audience will get quiet when you talk about responsibility. Predictably. Reliably.
Does that make sense?
I want to answer.
Misdirect. Jordan Peterson, Mr. Meaning, intentionality, climb up that hill, carry that cross, the kingdom awaits. No, let's just be like the unself-conscious mice that get to run around on this pan and don't flip it over, unless, of course, you drop some cheese in, and then they're all done.
To the behaviorist question, it's transformed into behavioral neuroscience and affective neuroscience and being taken over primarily by the biologists.
Yeah.
And part of the reason it's vanished is because it's become more and more difficult to do animal experimental work for all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
And because it requires a tremendous amount of technical expertise.
Right.
So,
but
so
the
that's,
theory of conditioning has also vanished with it.
No, it's transmuted and become more sophisticated and being incorporated into all sorts of theories. The most outstanding behaviorist was Jeffrey Gray, and he wrote a book called The Neuropsychology of Anxiety, which is an absolute work of genius, and it's very heavily influenced by the Skinnerian tradition.
Right.
I want to tie something back again, and I've been poking you about this, and I don't want to.
So The Skinnerians haven't departed. They've evolved.
Stop yet. Back to the distinction between you and Dawkins. Because I see you as a border figure. You've got one foot in the rationalist, humanist, atheist, empiricist world, firmly planted. But then there's the artist in you, which is a major part of your personality, and obviously a part that's incredibly productive and very well received, and that has an intellectual end as well. That domain, that second domain that you occupy, isn't formalized. The investigation of that isn't formalized as well by the atheist community.
No, you're right.
They lose what's there, and they don't value it properly. And that's a problem. Like with Dawkins, for example, I get letters from lots of people, lots and lots of people.
I bet you do.
And lots of them are nihilistic. And because they're nihilistic, they're suicidal.
They're like the chaff. They blow away.
I had a friend, I went for a walk with him the other week, and he was a communist, an atheist when he was a kid. He grew up in Poland, and he had criticized his family for celebrating Christmas because it was irrational. And then he realized at one point, he said, I could kill Christmas and we just have another weekend. That wouldn't actually, right, yeah. Because there's a magic there.
Yep.
So the Fry answer to that is, hey, you're a mouse in the pan. Just float along, and you inherited Christmas. Put up a tree.
That rationalism can destroy.
Yep.
And for reasons...
I have exactly that problem politically with the royal family, which on the face of it is, of course, preposterous, more preposterous even than Christmas and religion is the idea that we still
and more costly
have a royal family.
Except that, like Christmas, they probably do something for the British economy, especially when the royals act out. Then they're really fun to watch.
But
but you have a royal family.
Ceremony and ritual and symbolism is I look at America and I think if only Donald Trump and now Biden, if every week they had to walk up the hill and go into a mansion in Washington and there was Uncle Sam in a top hat and striped trousers, a living embodiment of their nation, more important than they were.
Is Uncle Sam real? You betcha he's real. Santa Claus too.
That's the key. Uncle Sam is America. The president is a fly-by-night politician voted for by less than half the population. And he has to bow in front of this personification of his country every week. And that personification, Uncle Sam can't tell him what to do. Uncle Sam can't...
The fortunate thing about Uncle Sam is he doesn't have children and grandchildren that get into trouble.
Can't say, no, pass this act and don't pass that act. And
so then we have the Obamas, who are the royal family for half of the country, and we have the Trumps, who are the royal family for the other half.
Free these people, give them a pardon. All he can do is say, tell me, young fella, what you done this week. And he'll bow and say...
Was that a slur? Against America? Oh.
Well, Uncle Sam, say, oh, you think that's the right thing for my country? Well, that's what a constitutional monarchy is. And of course it's absurd. But the fact that Churchill and Thatcher and everyone had to bow every week in front of this There's something. And also, empirically, look at the happiest countries in the world. That's all you need to do. And they happen to be constitutional monarchies. No.
Wait a minute. I thought that woman, her prayers not being answered meant that she's lower than an empiricist who sneaks some reason in to say, it's just all bunk. And so this is, he's arguing the other side now.
Norway, Sweden, Benelux, Japan, they're always right up there on the list. Now, it may be that we can't find the causal link between their constitutional monarchy, but it might just be something to do with that. And that's it's a way of answering your question in the same with
yes.
religion is that I can see the absurdities of the claims of many religions, and I can see the history of the wickedness and oppression and suppression, particularly in my own instance, being gay, growing up gay, and there's a long history of religion in particular being intolerant. And to this day, even this Pope Francis, whom I had some hopes for, seems to be beginning to add to an ancient slander and nonsensical attitude towards sexuality, which is extremely annoying.
But again, back to the large group. We don't know. Maybe, and people ask me about the gay thing all the time. And my answer is basically this. It's going to take the church hundreds of years to come to an answer, and then it still won't be a universal answer. But we'll know more in a few hundred years. We don't know it now. And part of the function that the church plays in society is that slow to change. You got fast changing things. And again, so I'm not disturbed by the liberties and rights that gay individuals have in this country and in the West. But I don't know where this goes. Same thing for the birth control pill. I don't know where this goes. We don't know. We'll find out. I'm watching things change, and I think we'll see. This conversation might not even last 100 years, and it might go in ways that surprise us.
And upsetting. But, I kind of, that doesn't mean I throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. I can see, in the same way that I don't believe in Greek mythology, in actual fact, I don't believe that on Olympus Zeus lived there with his wife Hera, but I do believe Hermes and Hera and Zeus live within us. There is a Hermes inside me. There is a trick.
The funny thing about actual is it's actually a word about time. It's now. And now is a funny thing in time. But actually, it's a very interesting word.
A liar, a joker, a cute, funny side, as well as a harmonic Apollonian and a bestial Dionysian side with his appetitive and addictive and frenzied. And I see the value and the truth in those religious manifestations, those principles, those elements of my character and the character of the human family.
In Mesopotamia, the god who became supreme was Marduk. And
yes.
He had 50 different names. And one of them was he who makes ingenious things as a consequence.
You've heard a lot about Marduk, too, if you listen to a lot of Jordan Peterson. Now, again, I'm going to say this, and I know I'm getting comments from my regular listeners because it's like, of course. Actually, if you got to this point in the video and you're already annoyed by me interrupting the other video is on this thing called YouTube, and you can watch it without me in it very reliably. In fact, far more people will watch that video than this video. But I'm going to fast forward through the Marduk stuff just like I did through the rat stuff.
Consequence of those of the tribe
gods. They came across.
Yeah, something like that.
And indeed, the Greek gods derived from those Mesopotamian gods. They came across.
Yeah, exactly.
That's an interesting argument, too. They derived from. And I get the sense of it, but what exactly, we don't know how that works either. We really don't.
A fundamental development in the history of religious thinking and dramatic thinking. Well, let's say each god is a manifestation of a value structure.
Yeah.
And we say, well, value structures have some commonalities across them, just like games have some commonalities across them, or languages have some commonalities across them. So then you start to aggregate gods.
Yeah.
And you produce a meta-god, and the meta-god is Marduk, and he's all eyes because he pays attention, like an empiricist, let's say, and speech.
Yeah.
And so the Mesopotamians had already figured out that attention and speech were the key elements of proper sovereignty.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Brilliant. And the Egyptians, right, they worshipped the eye. Same idea. And it was the eye in part that the Egyptians associated with the immortal soul, and they associated that with the proper locale of sovereignty.
Yeah.
Because they started to abstract out the idea of sovereignty from the sovereign. And so the sovereignty could be something that was now not embodied in any specific person, sort of like the Uncle Sam figure that you described.
Yes.
Wouldn't be the... I often thought with presidents, they'd have a much easier job if the symbolic weight was lifted from their shoulders. A fourth branch of government, right? Symbolic.
They'd have a little less power, too.
Which is what a constitutional monarchy exactly is, by accident of history, certainly not by design, but it just somehow the bits of the sovereign that were inimical to human development, the tyranny, the autocracy, the whimsical caprice, all these were sort of chipped away because of the human failings of different sovereigns, until by 1688, what we call in British history the Glorious Revolution, when the Bill of Rights was written and so on, which was the same as the American Bill of Rights 100 years later, essentially, but and it became a constitutional monarchy, and that was slowly refined as well. And of course, I know many people find it absurd and outrageous, and they live in palaces and they've got all this money and it's unjust. And of course, all that is true, and I wouldn't defend it on any rational grounds, but I would on empirical grounds.
Which is why your assault on Christianity is rational, not empirical.
Okay.
And maybe that's a good difference between rationalism and empiricism.
So this, you were talking about the gods within. Okay, and you said, well, you believe that the gods are within. And,
yes.
And I understand the claim that you're making and the limits of that claim, but I want to explore that. Okay, so as humanity advances, and we'll say advancement is the aggregation of larger societies, are more sophisticated.
Which is interesting because, again, it was Fry who earlier says, well, if we all stayed in these little tribes, then we wouldn't have guilty consciences. And yeah, but are you saying that when we were in that religion is a function of the agricultural revolution? Well, it certainly is tied to it, but it doesn't appear to be, because, again, we can go to the Americas, and the Americas were an interesting time capsule in terms of human cultures. We didn't find all these, even the civilizations in the Americas that were predominantly nomadic. We didn't find all these nihilistic tribes and atheistic tribes in America at all. They were more religious, at least in the way that we think about religious, than we city dwellers. Even today, the pagans are the ones of the country. They're religious.
View of the world, more technological power, that sort of thing, more ability to predict and control.
And indeed a longer lifetime. And health.
Yes, and the things that come along with that, and more peace by the looks of things, and more food, and
all the Steven Pinker things.
Right.
The things that likely afford the skepticism about religion itself, ironically.
Exactly that. So the gods aggregate and unify. That happens across as cultures collide and integrate. The gods integrate and unify. It's the battle between the gods in heaven. That's the parallel development to the battle between tribes for dominance on earth. But it's an integrative process as well as a submission process.
Yeah.
Right. And the one piece that he never mentions here is, of course, the Israelite exception, that they somehow didn't get incorporated, they somehow didn't become Marduk worshippers, and we don't find them in world cities worshiping Marduk. There are no Marduk temples. What happened to Marduk? Well, they're probably more
Okay, so those are within.
Yes.
Now you have an integrated God within.
Yes.
That's what tortures you with your conscience.
Yes, that's your Jiminy Cricket. It's your what philosophers call your deontic or deontological voice.
So then you ask
obligation.
yourself.
So the culture got into us.
Yep.
then you ask yourself, and this is a dead serious question. So imagine that people are exploring the moral domain whose reality is blatantly obvious, but difficult to formalize, let's say. We're exploring the nature of the moral realm tentatively, and we develop more powerful and more integrated theories as we progress. And you end up with a unified God, so it's a monotheism. There's a God within. Then the question is, well, what exactly is that God within? Does it correspond to something that's real? Or is it just a figure of the imagination? But then you say, well, if it's just a figure of the imagination, what exactly
correspond to a God who's real? What does real mean in that phrase? See, again, I think it's a function of we have to imagine it as a story, sort of a physically imagined story. I don't think we can do any other thing and think of it as real.
Exactly is that God within? Does it correspond to something that's real? Or is it just a figure of the imagination? But then you say, well, if it's just a figure of the imagination, what exactly is the imagination? See, I think partly Christianity insists that this integrated God figure also had a real existence. That's how Christianity tries to
had or has
solve this particular problem.
Yes.
And people like C.S. Lewis and Jung to some degree as well would say, well, once in history, someone acted out that unified God so completely that something happened.
That gets into the power of acting out. And this is in many ways the assumption of the modern world, that if I take metal and I put it in a blast furnace, I take the ore and I put it in a blast furnace, and we have all of these processes that are, again, I look at Drew Johnson, this video that he had, where they looked at, if all you have is the Bible, you won't quite know how to be an Iron Age priest. There are a lot of prescriptions about the tabernacle and the temple, but they're insufficient to actually act it out. What you really need is sort of an oral tradition that runs alongside. And I know when you get to the New Testament period, that oral tradition, yada, 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 that goes a whole different place I'm not intending to go. But we have all of these specialized actions that yield in technology things, okay? And so the thought that we can act out things in our world that engage with that, with being, God number one and God number two, with the God that is arenic and also agentic, that produces changes in the world on through history to the degree that Stephen Fry, atheist though he is somehow embarrassed for being rude to people. And so he will shrink back when Jordan Peterson tells a personal story of suffering, from imagining that, well, the last thing he wants to do is be morally culpable by adding suffering to a suffering person. And Jesus acting things out changed the world so dramatically that Stephen Fry, though he thinks Jesus, if he existed at all, was nothing more than just the nihilist serf. No, the nihilist serf is like chaff. Jesus is like this massive tree that keeps changing the world.
That's unified. Well, would say, well, once in history, someone acted out that unified God so completely that something happened. That's the proposition. Okay, well, that's the limit of the proposition. Yeah. And then the question is, well, how real is this moral striving?
How real? What does that mean? How deeply can this impact the world in the future? The serf asks, the religious serf, how real is the moral striving that keeps the serf tilling the soil, feeding his children, at his knees, tithing in prayer to build up a civilization. How real? How much does it govern? How much does it pursue and create a future? Like a tree planted like a river, not like the chaff.
Real enough. Well, how real is this moral striving? It's real enough so you torture yourself when you don't engage in it properly. It's real enough so you can't avoid its call. It's real enough so that you can make moral errors that are so severe that you can doubt the validity of your own existence. It's real enough for that.
Oh, there's the meaning crisis.
And this is an honest question. It's like, I don't know. But I certainly see that how much good is done when people are good and how much evil is done when they're evil.
Yes. But it's
and how much that becomes like a tree planted by the river. This whole idea of flourishing, which we somehow know but can't fully describe. You know, good, well, we use these words, they're dead reckoning, but how they scale, we don't know.
Very hard, I think, empirically, to be really boring and use the word again. It's quite, to build up a list and show that there is more morality on the side of those who followed a particular faith, a particular systematic religion, than those who didn't. It's...
That's what statisticians do. Oh, Amazon lets me know when I bought my book. You last purchased this book in November 18, 1997. I've been buying from Amazon for a while. George Gallup, The Saints Among Us. This point that Fry makes, well, we wouldn't know. Well, George Gallup decided to find out what we could know and couldn't know. And so he wrote about it in this book, The Saints Among Us. And it gets into this question. And I have a copy around here somewhere that I can't seem to lay my hands on, but I know it's in this room. But you can get a used copy for $1.96 at Amazon.
Well,
that's really the question. That's
you can certainly have morality without religion. That is
okay. Let's take that for a second. Move back to the political.
Yeah.
Okay, because that's the key issue.
Yes.
So let's say we're going to defend the values of the West to the degree that they're worth defending. Then
well, let's go back to morality without religion. Now, what he means by that is a person who is not religious in the way that in the secular world we tag religion may outperform someone who is religious. Absolutely. Common. See it all the time. Some of my most moral friends, they don't go to church. They don't believe in God. They don't do anything. They're highly moral people. Does that mean they have their morality without religion? That their morality somehow came about in a religious clean room, a room devoid of religion, the way a manufacturer of sensitive electronics keeps a room devoid of dust or contamination of any kind? No. And again, back to this book. It's just so hard to argue that the reason Fry feels guilty if he's not kind to someone is because even though he can't personally connect his morality to religion, there is no clean room. History abhors a clean room.
And we are making a claim that the inherent issue.
Yes.
So let's say we're going to defend the values of the West. To the degree that they're worth defending, then we are making a claim that the inheritors of a particular tradition have something valid morally on their side, or we cannot defend that position. And we can't defend the position. I mean, look, I know this is bothering you, what's happening in the broader public landscape.
Yeah.
You got tangled up, for example, with J.K. Rowling, right?
Well,
with what's happening around her.
Yeah, she's a friend and will remain a friend. But I'm also sorry that people are upset. The two things are not incompatible. I don't have to break links with J.K. Rowling to say that I have huge sympathy and I endorse the efforts of trans people everywhere to live the lives that they feel they want to lead. And I hate how that they are often, treated. And I recognize the courage it takes to.
Yes, and you've put your money where your mouth is on that front. over the course of your whole life?
I've tried to, yes.
Yeah, so it's not just a claim. You can look at your biography and see that.
Yeah.
But
he's a deeply moral Christian. Sorry. He's a deeply moral man in a way that Christians recognize as moral. He might not be a moral man in the way Vikings recognize as moral.
But you're disturbed nonetheless at what's, let's say, there's something that's happening in our culture that's not sitting right with you. Okay, how do you defend the damn culture against it without making the claim that we do have something of, let's say, higher value that is the consequence of following a particular tradition?
Yes.
Because without that, you lose the argument instantly.
I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with the necessity that we all have of redefining it. We have to remember that morality is a question of manners. It is literally what morality means. That our parents and grandparents had a very, very different and very firm sense of what was immoral. If the word immoral was used in a newspaper or by a person, then that person's immoral. It would have a sexual meaning. It would mean that they lived with someone with whom they weren't married, or they lived with someone of the same sex, or that in some way they were philanderers or loose in their morals, meant entirely to do with the bedroom. These were the
Not entirely. Because it would also have to do with what they did with their money, and would have to do with whether they went to church. In fact, although sexual behavior was a main focus of it, I would argue that part of that focus is because if you're going to maintain a community, there's nothing that can destroy that community faster than unregulated sex. And I think that's true. I think a murderer would be defined as immoral. I think an alcoholic would be defined as immoral. I think someone who, in fact, spent their money frivolously would be defined as immoral. There are a great many things that morality was defined as. But now he's about to say something that I don't believe he actually knows what he's saying or believes.
In their sex, or that in some way they were philanderers or loose in their morals, meant entirely to do with the bedroom. These were the unforgivable behaviors of a generation that close to us. We can still hug them if we're allowed to in the garden in COVID times. That's how quickly morality changes. So the idea of the culture is a false one. There is no the culture. It's not like a human version of a biosphere, even, I don't think.
Really? Really? Because why would we go about putting out videos like this? Now, rightfully so, there are multiple competing cultures. But these cultures are powerful, and they do hold sway, which is why we're interested in them and why we care.
There is the state of things as now exist, but like when you were talking about religion and saying this,
the other thing is there is the state of things that now exist. Okay, so you've got your empiricism, you have your rationality, you have your data, you have your narrative. There is the state of things that now exists. You can't deal with the right without the right and left hemisphere. You have to, in order to make your argument, you need to throw things up into the heavens and for them to stick and for them to stay there and to say, this is what's becoming. And so we're constantly in the midst of these two world mythologies, is and ought and now and becoming. And we're just always in the middle, and we use those to function. It's how words work. It's how we work. There's going to be no way around any of this.
This God, that what religion has been brilliant at, and it's needed to be, but so has science, is redefining what God is. What God was in 1400, God was capable of doing remarkable things. He was answerable for everything.
Sort of like I don't know, laws of physics are today. God was this arena that we acted within. In him we live and move and have our being. Even the Stoics thought that. God was all around us, and God brought fat years and lean years, and God brought good things and bad things, and God brought, and God brought, and God brought. We used agentic language, and we related to that God in an agentic way, even when we understood he was arenic. And so what eventually happened was we sort of became pagans. And that's kind of where we're becoming, because, well, God is now a being that is an agent within a meta-divine realm.
And we worshipped him for it. A couple of hundred years later, a few things had been taken away from him, and we could answer for traveling the world and knowing it, and discovering how the stars actually were not holes in a black cloth, but maybe were celestial objects with the, and then a few hundred years later, and similarly
discovering that, well, we used to think God was shining through the stars. Now they're just balls of burning gas. You mean God can't shine through something spherical as he could something that's two-dimensional? Because, again, that's where we're at with this. It's, God number one and God number two. I'm always asked to define these things. God number one is, so John Vervaeke talks about the agent-arena relationship. God number one is arenic. He's like the arena in which we live and move and have our being. God number two is agentic. He's an agent. We relate to him personally. And the Christian God is both, inherited from the Jewish God, who was both. And in this way, the Jews were not taken up into Marduk, because Marduk was always only one agent. The Jews believed in other gods because there's, well, the sons of God's angels. I mean, those categories we can't help but use after 2,000 years of Christianity. But over the last 500 years, God became increasingly like Zeus, when beforehand he wasn't like Zeus. And that's, well, again, this book, which you can't buy used because I mentioned it too much and there weren't that many out there, and so they all got bought up, and now they're like $700, which is ridiculous.
The science, we use the word cosmos. Well, cosmos used to mean a very small sphere of the.
Look at Lewis. It wasn't small. Ancients understood this.
Was a section of the solar system, and now it's some infinite thing, and there may indeed be dozens.
It's not infinite.
Of them, millions of them.
Now we're getting into multiverses. Oh, now we're back in religion, aren't we? Because we're making this stuff up without evidence, right? Isn't that the definition?
Who knows? According to string theory and quantum theory and all kinds of Schrödinger's number and all the rest of it, everything is redefined in each generation. So what is left that is absolute? And this is where religion has an argument with intellectual progress, because it wants to hang on to some.
You don't have intellectual progress without religion, because progress implies this static, rational thing that doesn't change, by which you can measure change. You can't measure change unless you imagine something, some perspective, or some place or something against which change is measured. Otherwise, you won't notice change.
Something that it believes is eternal and permanent and utterly always true. But there is no such thing. The morality, I did a debate with Christopher Hitchens, actually, about the Catholic Church, and the people defending it, when we attacked their attitude towards child sex scandals, said, well, in the 1960s, it wasn't such a big sin. And that is actually true. But
you can't live this way. So was it or wasn't it right? Because once you use that word right, you're up there in the heavenlies, right, to discriminate against gay people. No, that's always wrong. Because if it's not always wrong, then it wasn't wrong back then, and it won't be wrong in the future. It's only wrong now. You're cutting off the branch you're sitting on.
It's not true coming from a Catholic whose whole point is that they are eternally true, that their morality is as true now as it was when St. Peter founded the church. That their enemy is people like me who are relativists, who say that there is no absolute morality, but that things change according to situation, circumstance, and knowledge. And so...
Knowledge? What realm does knowledge come from? Does knowledge change? See, this can't hold together.
That is true of God. God alters every day. He adds a little bit of a quality here, or she does, and takes away another bit. Now no longer responsible for disease and no longer responsible for earthquakes, but maybe
God, number one.
Responsible for something else. But it's a shrinking kingdom. And so the idea of there being an absolute and an eternal, it just doesn't seem to square with the way we have developed certainly over.
The idea just doesn't seem to square, and that idea is true. But it self-referentially doesn't work.
The history, which is to say over the last 5,000 years, since we've been able to...
How many histories?
Write things down. Before that, we can only judge how and who we were according to objects and artifacts and architecture.
And that was better before we were conscious or self-conscious, before we were even great apes and couldn't swim.
Since we've been able to write, it's pretty clear that the instability of, and I'm not saying this in a Derrida way of instability of meaning, although I do think you've misunderstood Derrida. I hope you read Peter Salmon's biography, by the way. It might change your mind about him, but that's a whole other subject. Yeah, so I'm
okay,
so with you on
let's
this.
go back. Okay, so let's go after the eternal verities idea.
Yeah.
Clearly, religious conceptions shift. Although there's a core tradition that remains intact.
Well, a tradition by definition stays intact.
There's something that identifies it as the same entity across time.
Yes,
and
right.
Maybe that's even mutable. But I've looked for what might be regarded as eternal verities in the moral domain. So let me put a few forward.
Yeah.
The beautiful is more valuable than the ugly.
Yeah. Yep.
Truth is to be sought after in opposition to falsehood.
Yeah.
That's particularly true in relationship to the spoken word. The spoken word brings about remarkable transformations of reality itself. And it's for that reason that verbal truth is constitutive, but also of vital ethical significance.
Doesn't that make it all the more important to look at the discourse beneath verbal speech, I hesitate to use the word, but to deconstruct it, or at least to attempt to look at the currents that run through speech, to see, and they're not all Derridarian or Lacanian or Foucaultian, whatever the adjective of Foucault is. They're not all about power. They're not all necessarily Marxist. The project, the Saussurean project and the others of looking at where language comes from, not just in a philological sense of derivation, but in a sense of where the discourses come from is paramount, therefore. And so to say verbal, it's not just an utterance is in and of itself transformative, or if it is transformative, it might be wickedly so, or it might be negatively so at least.
You're not going to get out of relativism using words like wicked or negative.
Is that not right?
Well, with regards to your point about the analysis of the narratives and even the deconstruction, I would say it depends on the motive. And it's the motive. And this is, I suppose, to some degree why
Well, and Lewis, of course, you deconstruct, you see through something in order to see to something, to look at something. You move away knowledge that's in the way to see truer, more foundational, more reliable knowledge that endures.
I'm skeptical, let's say, of the atheist skepticism. It's destructive. There's a destructive element to it. There's no archaeological redemption.
But that's not
because it's like chaff. It blows away.
nothing to do with motive. You said it was all about the motive.
Well, that's not necessarily the case, that it has nothing to do with motive. Motive's a tough one.
Yeah, it is. I mean, if my motive is to make money and I make a great discovery, it's as valuable as if my motive was to make a great discovery and I made a great discovery. The great discovery is made.
But the implementation of that discovery might impact what all of us would consider to be the value and the glory that discovery would yield. And we would very quickly use a very Christian metric to evaluate it, such as, does it do the most good for the most number of people for the most amount of time? I regularly hear atheists use arguments like this, most. And I think it's a good argument. But where does that argument come from? It's a very democratic argument that believes that individuals are image bearers of God and therefore something that belongs to God, like a great discovery. Well, what is that? Is it an invention, or did in fact I discover? You get the idea that it was out there and I brought it either into being from potentiality or from I uncovered it and it's discovered because it belongs to everyone, which, well, now we're back in God's territory.
How is the motive relevant?
Well, because your motives determine the decisions you make along the way.
Yeah.
If I'm fundamentally motivated by the belief that being is worth preserving, let's say, because
we have this conversation with respect to vaccines. Well, once they discovered a vaccine, shouldn't they share it with everyone? And that's actually a very interesting conversation. When my initial thought was, yes, absolutely, put it in the public domain and let the vaccine manufacturers reproduce it. And then I heard some arguments on the other side which said, yeah, but, and then I thought, maybe that's not the way to go. But that is our instinctive answer because of Christ.
Because your motives determine the decisions you make along the way.
Yeah.
If I'm fundamentally motivated by the belief that being is worth preserving, let's say, because on the whole it's a good, I'm going to react and think much differently than if I'm ambivalent about that, or if I feel at the bottom of my soul that the whole bloody project is of questionable utility and might as well be shelved.
In other words, the nihilist is in trouble. The person on their knees believes being is good and is leaning into it, suffering notwithstanding.
And that dichotomy, that characterizes us. We have Cain and Abel inhabiting us. There's no doubt about that. That's a fundamental truth. And if Cain has the upper hand, even if it's in the scientific endeavor, the consequences of that manifest themselves, and they manifest themselves destructively.
And we see this all the time in academia. Academia can be cutthroat. Academia is seldom about, does the truth come out, or is it more important that I capture the intellectual property so that I may be glorified? And it gets back to the cake maker. Which is the best cake maker? The one who makes the cake and puts it out there and watches the people enjoy it? Oh my, who made this? This is delicious. This is delightful. Who made this? I want to know who made this. I want to have the recipe. It's Jesus' story about take the back seat. The cake maker that says, if I put this out there, people might taste it. And there's a little bit of this, a little bit of that. They might deconstruct my cake, and then they might make my cake. And then, I need an entire legal framework to protect the intellectual property that is the recipe for my cake. Yeah, there's a world of difference.
That's why it's interesting that you have to say Cain and Abel, because I think this brings us back to the very beginning, is the importance of myth and also of parable. And I'd like to end, because we're getting towards a bit where I have to move away. Oscar Wilde is known as an you know, a master of epigrams and wit, and people mistakenly think of him as shallow or trivial or facetious or vain or peacocky or something. But
I don't know why people would think that if they've ever read anything by the man.
he was very profound, in fact, and of course he could be peacocky too. But there's a story
that isn't necessarily at odds with.
No, they don't rule each other out. But here's an example of a great parable, which is why, again, it's why I love literature and the art of wit, because it zooms to the truth so much more quickly, it seems to me, than
the truth. That would be something that doesn't change, right? That would be something that we look at the enormous diversity of this world and can take something out of it and say, there. We can see much via the one thing. We can see the world via one story. The multiplicity in one insight.
So many other attempts to describe or rationalize truth. And here's one where Wilde was at a dinner, and someone was being rather kind of envious of someone and being rather unpleasant. And Wilde suddenly said, the devil was walking one day in the Libyan desert, and he saw a monk being tormented by some of his demons. And he approached, and the demons bowed in front of him and said, Master. And he said, what goes on here? They said, Master, for 39 days and 39 nights, we have tried to tempt this holy monk away from his God and his religion. But he has stayed steadfast and holy to his God and his religion. We have offered him powers and principalities. We have offered him the joys of the flesh. We have offered him wine and food and riches, but he has turned us down. There's nothing that we can do to win this holy man to our cause. And the devil said, out of my way. And he whispered in the monk's ear. And instantly the monk took the pectoral cross around his neck and snapped it and filled the air with hideous curses against his God and his church and his religion, and swore he would never follow Christ again. And the demons fell down in front of the devil and said, Master, what can you have said in 1 second that we could not? What did you say to him? And the devil said, oh, it was very simple. I just told him his brother had been made Bishop of Alexandria. Now, that seems to me, A, it's very funny, but B, it is profoundly truthful. And it is, this is...
It takes so much of our experience and lifts it up and says, there. There. You want to know human beings? There. Right there.
Is the way we show people how envy and resentment are so much a part of who we are that if, you know, I mean, it seems like a trivial example, but it's a model to me that if you want to say something and you want to change minds and you want to,
out of the motivation of the kindness of your heart, improve people's lives, I'm with you.
To burn people with the flame of love and hope and connection that we all secretly believe in, that you know, that makes us gasp when we read poetry, or makes us feel what love is and joy and all the things that we're mostly too embarrassed to talk about because they're a bit soppy, but truly they matter more.
You Brits and your embarrassment. You're such a what's with your culture? We Americans, we're out there. Woo-hoo!
More than anything else, we displace them on kittens and so on, but we really, really, we care about these things. And the way I think to bond people to it is not to talk abstractly about ideas necessarily, unless you're talking to someone who has the same reading as you. And that sounds a snobbish point, but unless you're talking to someone who's also read the same books, or at least has the same ideas as you, or is open to them, it just becomes a bit lectury. Whereas if you can tell a story instead, or a parable, that's, especially if it's funny or it's sexy or it's, you know, got some quality that just tickles, you know, that strokes us, then you bring people to a connection. And unfortunately, most of the world who use the art of rhetoric and persuasion and do it for nefarious purposes. And maybe that's the key, is to try and
If only we knew what nefarious was, because nefarious just seems to change. What's nefarious today wasn't nefarious 100 years ago, and what was nefarious 100 years ago wasn't nefarious today. You know, there's a certain amnesia that takes hold when we have a conversation. We forget what was uttered the last few minutes ago, and we don't bring it in and say, now, wait a minute. I thought this whole nefariousness was something that is relative to a time and place. And the whole observation that sometimes the devil has all the good storytellers. The thing that every preacher will tell you is that most of the people, Fry is exactly right here, most of the people won't remember these fine theological points that you make. They will deflect your admonitions. They will accept them, they will deflect them by either saying, "Oh yes, you're right," and not think that your admonition requires anything of them, or they'll deflect them in defensiveness. But the stories get through, which brings me to this quote that those of you who listen to my rough drafts for Sunday know, I use this slide a lot. Imagine you've got to write a story in which for the first time someone who suffers the excruciating death of a slave is going to be cast as being in some way part of the Creator God who's fashioned everything. And he's got to be convincing not just to people now, but for 2,000 years and across the whole span of the world. It's really an astonishing thing to have pulled off as a literary feat. And that 4 people did so is amazing. And of course, what those 4 people had in common is the person they wrote about, who, by acting in that way, has so colonized Stephen Fry that he can't even see the Jesus that is moving through him, even as he's, in many ways, a much more effective atheist apologist than these 4 horsemen.
Try and build up, as you are doing, and I hope I'm doing in my own way, the value of story and looking deeply into the nature of characters within stories, that even though it's just a story, it might actually be a portal to something really profound that will touch you and change your life.
And maybe even change the world.
That's just exactly the right place to stop.
Yeah, good. I'm sorry it has to stop, but it's been wonderful. It's been
me
an hour
too.
and 3/4.
I knew that we would. I was primarily worried about this conversation because there were so many things that I wanted to talk to you about. I didn't know what I would talk to you about.
Well, we may have to have a second one in a few months.
Yes, well, after we digest this one.
Yeah.
I hope they do. It was delightful. So I hope my commentary was productive for you. I know some of you wrote to me and said, are you going to do this one? Are you going to do this one? And some of you wrote to me and said, you have to do this one. Okay, have to. But it was a delight. It was a good conversation, and I hope you liked it. Leave me a comment. Let me know what you think.